one, and we are live.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the free Assange online vigil series number 15.0. My name is Taylor Hudak, and I'm joined with my co-hosts Andrew Smith, Christy Doff, and Steve Poikonen. Today marks day 188 since the brutal arrest of WikiLeaks founder and multi-award-winning journalist Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and day 3,235 of his unlawful and arbitrary detention. And as for Chelsea Manning, today marks 217 days since she has been imprisoned, and she is now up to $108,000 in fines. So for tonight, we will be discussing world news, including an update on the crisis in Ecuador and the protests in Barcelona. In addition, we will discuss MIA's press conference and the press freedom panel, which included the special rapporteur on torture, Nils Melzer. But before all of that, we are joined by our first guest of the evening, Jose. Jose is joining us from South America, and he is here to update us on the current crisis in Ecuador. Jose, thank you so much for joining us this evening. How are you?
Fine, are you?
We're doing well. If you could just provide us with a brief history of what is happening in Ecuador at this time, as well as an update.
Yes, the protests in Ecuador are tied with Assange and the United States. So in March of this year, the IMF signed a loan agreement with Ecuador, and in March, Assange was evicted. And before that, when Lenín Moreno won the elections in 2017, 2 weeks after the election, before starting his presidency, Paul Manafort visited Lenin. And in that meeting, they discussed Assange, Chevron, and giving away all our natural resources, our hydroelectric plants, everything. So now comes now after March, Julian Assange is evicted, and in July, this past July, 2019, Ecuador signed a security agreement with the United States. And they opened the door to US surveillance 100%. And so the IMF already, since they had signed the agreement in March, they were little by little letting people know here in Ecuador, that they were making cuts here and there, here, very little, until this October, when Lenin pushed the executive decree 883, which liberalized the gas prices and the removal of government subsidies from gas prices, and also a cut on labor rights. Tremendous cuts on labor rights. I mean, this guy wants to return us to the 19th century, where everybody was a slave. So, and that's why the protest started, because the economic situation after 2 years under Lenin has made the Ecuadorian people a lot poorer. There is a lot of unemployment, and that presidential decree basically, it was taking food away from us Ecuadorians, and to give that money to the IMF. That's basically what it boils down to. He's taking food from us and giving that money saved to the IMF. So that's why the protests.
So, what were the protests? Are you able to speak a little bit about what the protests were like? I know that the police and the military in Ecuador were
Yeah.
really being pretty brutal on the protesters, and I think that we definitely want to
Yes.
highlight that because it is very, very troubling, to say the least. So, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. Well, the scale and the magnitude of the military and police occupation and violence in Ecuador was at the national level. And it's a brutal repression that has never happened in Ecuador. We've had, protests and everything, but not at this magnitude, not at this magnitude. And uh, and knowing that Lenin Moreno signed an agreement, security agreement, the U.S. was highly suspected of being involved in this repression
Well,
because
the timing of it is just it it's too perfect. The
yeah,
You mentioned it. I mean, the IMF loan is secured right after Julian Assange is discussed by Lenin Moreno and people from the Trump administration. It looks like Lenin Moreno sold Julian Assange to intelligence for $4.2 billion. And then on top of that, yeah, I think you just brought it up, but there was a live feed from the Ecuadorian embassy to the CIA once they were already spying on
yes.
Julian Assange in the embassy, but it went from the levels of spying increased, and this is something that we found out that Moreno knew about, and not just knew about, but gave a green light to, uh, and why that on its face hasn't just destroyed the entire case against Julian Assange, I can't figure out.
Well, Assange is being used as an example, so that it does not repeat again. So they want to spread fear on all of us to just keep quiet and not make public any government corruption or crimes. They just want us to be quiet, and they don't want the people to know.
What
That's
is the
basically what it is.
what is the Ecuadorians citizens' perspective on Julian Assange?
Well, after when they evicted Assange, uh, for Ecuadorians, it was a very painful thing because no foreign government had ever entered our embassy to arrest a a person that we had given refuge to us. Assange was being persecuted by the United States. So we were uh, for us it was very painful to see those images of Assange being evicted by the London police. So uh, so that's at that time when the eviction happened. A lot of Ecuadorians began to use Assange images on their contact page. You know, so you are going to see in Ecuador a lot of images. People in social media having their as a contact image the Assange picture there.
So here in the United States, you get a lot of mixed feelings from people about Julian, just from people completely inundated with propaganda, people that know everything that happened with him, and everyone in between. Um, what's the education level like for people out there? Like, do they understand who Julian Assange is better than the American population, you would say, because of the intimate involvement in their lives almost?
No, in Ecuador, they really, I mean, the intellectuals know, about all the data that he released on the crimes of the United States. But the intellectuals, we are just a minority. You understand me? So, so I could not say that most Ecuadorians know the details on Assange.
Would you say that most Ecuadorians support him though? Or is it something that
Yes,
they're kind of just
yes,
up in
they
the air?
do. Yes, they do because he was our guest at the embassy, and it's for us. If you invite a person to your house to stay, that's a very sensitive issue for us. It's
And
like
how is he
having
represented in
a guest stay in your house, and the police comes and takes him away. That's very painful.
how would you say the Ecuadorian media represented him during that whole thing? Like as he was getting removed in the time leading up to it?
Well, the Ecuadorian media is, the owners are of the TV and newspaper. They're all millionaires. They all belong to the ruling elites who got accustomed of uh, using the government, to fill their pockets.
Now, what is the perspective on the United States by that of the Ecuadorian people? Because, of course,
Well,
the IMF, the United States is heavily involved in that, of course. So,
well, very few people know the United States is involved in this. So, social media, the people who, few people who got to see the involvement of the United States, uh, it's indirect because you cannot, for example, there was a armor plated all RFID truck that they tested it on the protest on the October 7th. The truck was speaking in English.
now
Can
tell
you
us
imagine?
more. I'm sorry, go
So
ahead.
so so when I saw that video, I knew the United States was involved. I knew the United States was involved. It's a brand new armor-plated car that they had just brought in that day.
What's
So to what
the what's the situation on the ground right now? Because Moreno fled as far, and has he returned? Is there any
Yes.
government? What's the lay of the land?
Well, he returned after agreeing with the sorry, uh, after agreeing with the ancestral people. But you see, the protest was not just the ancestral people organizations; it was the whole Ecuador. But Lenin Moreno said he would only negotiate with the ancestral people. He did not want to negotiate with the people of Ecuador, which are a majority. So he fooled them. He fooled them. He told them that he would the night of the agreement. He made another decree saying that he was eliminating the famous decree number 883. The one that raised the taxes, the cost of the gas. But then on an article, he put an article in there saying that the decree was temporary, that the measures being described in the decree were temporary, and that a new one would be made, and gives no detail of what the new one will have, nor does it say when. So most people have not bothered to read the new decree that he made.
Jose, there were some reports in the US that the IMF loan was canceled. Can you speak to that on is there a situation where that might happen, or has that happened at all that you know about?
No, it was not canceled. It was not canceled because you see, this is a package loan that they say is $10 billion for 2019, but they already gave Lenin Moreno 4.2 something several months ago. So there is still you know, the rest. I think 2 months ago they gave him 600 million more, and I guess they told him, you know, if you want the rest of the money, you have to cut the gas, you know, the gas. You have to raise the gas taxes, liberalize the prices,
So
and that money
Jose,
will come to us.
we have some questions from our viewers in the chat, and this
Yes.
is coming from Dak Rouleau. He wants to know if President Lenin Moreno will make it through his first term. I know that many people in Ecuador are calling for his resignation.
I think he will, because he is being protected by the United States first, by the military, by the police, and by the private media. So notice that when the people, thousands of people went to the capital, Quito, to protest, he moved the government out of the capital. He just moved it. So when the protesters were able to get inside the presidential palace, there was no president to remove because he was gone to another city.
So we have another question also coming from our friend Propaganda, that is Quinn, and he wants to know more information about the military joining these protests. He's asking, was it only a fraction of the military, or was it most of the military that joined the protests?
All of it, all of it. And there are reports, there are witnesses that were close to the armored vehicles that were circling in Quito, and they heard people speaking English inside. So it was the United States that had a direct involvement in this. And also today, it confirms that today. I think about an hour ago, I posted a tweet from our fiscal attorney that went to visit the ambassador of the United States to help us, to help the Ecuadorian government on the investigations, on all the persecutions that they are making. So the agreement was signed 3 days ago, and there is a big political persecution against our leaders. And I posted a picture where Lenin Moreno is with 10. That picture was a few years ago when he was not president. And there were 10 people from the party around Lenin Moreno. 8 of them have a jail sentence, or they are already in jail or escaped out of Ecuador. And 6 of them are seek the political asylum inside the Mexican embassy in Quito. There is a brutal persecution right now going on.
Can we circle back to the Ecuadorian military intervening on behalf of the protesters for a moment, just real quick? Because I saw some video of that on Twitter, and I gotta tell you, gave me hope. It really did, because watching, I mean, it for me, watching a cop get his ass kicked is like spectator sport, you know. Um,
Yeah.
I'm just not personally a fan, but watching, like a 12 pack of soldiers roll up and the police start shit, and to see that follow through to its conclusion within like 15 or 20 seconds was just, man, it was delightful. It really
Ah,
was. And
I
was
mean
this
the fight.
just in Quito, or was this like countrywide?
No, it was, well, the protests were countrywide, and that fight that you are talking about was in the city of Guayaquil
Okay.
between police and the military.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's just that's good stuff, because the at least here, um the concept of the United States government turning its military on civilians is not uh out of the scope of our history. It started very early on in our history. The first, like, quote unquote military action that George Washington ordered was the Whiskey Rebellion. He sent Alexander Hamilton and a company of troops out to go collect taxes, essentially. Um,
Yes.
but the logistics of the U.S. military and all volunteer military, the logistics of them grid searching a place like Manhattan, looking for individual people, I think would promote the kind of international outrage and possible um, invitation to step in, uh, if something like that were to occur. And I feel like there are enough people in the military who understand exactly what it is they're doing and what their job is and who they're doing it for, and it's not God, it's not country. That I want to believe that enough active duty service members would uh, join a protest of that nature were we to do it. And I'll open that
Well,
up to everyone to take a crack at. But go ahead, Jose.
yes. Well, you know uh, the Ecuadorian military does have political sides, and but you know, society has changed. We are more, you know, our societies of today are more, you know, materialized, and you know, they gotta have the nice car and the nice apartment, and you know, the nice telephone. So those soldiers were basically, you know, like mercenaries. They didn't care about shooting you know, their own, citizens. They were afraid to, you know, to be jailed and, you know, lose their jobs. That's what they think. Losing my job? No, no. So, you know, but I'm sure, you know, they will have PTSD after this, you know, for years.
Jose, you
And
brought up an
that,
interesting point about how you heard people were speaking English. Are you
yes,
suggesting that Americans were on Ecuadorian soil
ye-
acting as military during
yes,
these protests? And what right do
yes,
Americans have to be there?
yes, yes. That's what the witnesses say, that they were close to the uh, armored vehicles, that they heard people talking English inside. So
With
I think,
American accents?
yes, pardon me.
I said with
So,
American accents then?
I have no idea, but the witnesses, it's dangerous for them. They probably get killed if they come public with that.
Okay.
So I
So
like to look at a lot of what's happening in the world as what will be allowed to happen in the US. And a lot of the ways that you see what's happening with Palestinians and how they just get sniped or tear gassed from drones and things like that. Do you think what's happening in Ecuador, Jose, would be a good, I don't know, like future predictor of what would happen in the United States if civil unrest did hit us like this?
well, it's I think in the United States, it's a divided society, and those groups will probably choose one side or the other. So, and it also depends who controls the media. You control the media, you control the people.
Now, Telesur was shut down as well. Is that correct?
Yes. Also, they shut down a radio station that refused to broadcast government propaganda.
Jose, we
But
had
here
a
is
question. Oh, go ahead.
yes, here is a good news. The private media were for 10 years lying and attacking Rafael Correa. And for 2 years, they were hiding Lenin's lies. They were promoting him. Well, I tell you, now on these protests, the people went and destroyed the TV stations, the private TV stations. They destroyed their equipment, the offices that they had. So it was a payback time.
I'm for that. Thank you, Jose. I appreciate that. It's good looking out.
And do you think that was most directly because of the state-sponsored propaganda that they ran?
Yes, yeah, because Lenin Moreno is working for them, you know. So the people went and destroyed their antennas, their installations, everything, because the people were mad, you know. People were knew, what they were doing.
Man, can you imagine if we reacted to propaganda like that? Holy shit.
God, I wish we did. ABC
Right?
wouldn't have a place to actually cover news anymore.
Right?
Jose, someone in our chat was asking if you happen to have an update on Jorge Glass or have heard anything recently on his condition.
Yes. Today he was refused. You see what they did here for him. They had several people file accusations against him, false accusations. So the judge, controlled by Lenin Moreno, they just accept them, even if there is no evidence or false evidence. They just accept them, and they being so the Glass lawyer appeals, and the corrupt judges, they just deny the appeals one by one.
So, Jose, for those who are unfamiliar with Jorge Glass and his
Yes.
situation, can you provide a brief background on him for the viewers?
Yes.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All this has happened that you have seen, the protest and the IMF, what all that Lenin has done, the Assange eviction, would not have been possible if Vice President Glass would have been in his presidential office. Would not have been possible. That's why the first thing that Lenin Moreno did was put him in jail in 2017, November 2017. So he
So
has.
do you think Moreno's actually going to be able to complete his term? Like, do you think that there's enough propaganda and enough people do you think people would eventually settle down if he kind of just makes enough concessions, or will it be something like the Yellow Vest movement where it just keeps going into the long run? And I think I may have missed this question earlier, but I'll ask it again.
Well, the problem is that the new decree that Lenin Moreno did, and all private media broadcast as the cancellation of the gas price increases. It's actually, people are fooled. They think that they had a victory, that their protest, give a good result. But they don't know that that's not true. They are fooling themselves. But the private media, that's what they did. They made the people think that their protest was successful.
Right. So we are going to bring in our second guest of the evening.
Okay.
Jose, stick with us though, please. But our next guest joining us for a panel discussion is Joe Kishore. Joe is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and a writer for the World Socialist website. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thanks, and thanks for having me. And I found what Jose was saying very, very interesting, and I think raised a lot of important points.
Right. Do you have any thoughts or statements you want to make on what we've been discussing thus far?
Well, I think that it raises a number of very critical issues, in particular in terms of the strategy for the defense of Julian Assange, and in particular the connection between the persecution of Assange and the attack on the working class and the vast majority of the population. Therefore, the connection between the defense of Assange and the conditions of the working class, the vast majority of the population in Ecuador, internationally. Because I think what you see in Ecuador now is growing social opposition, protests, and as Jose was saying, this is in response to IMF-dictated austerity measures. It's bound up with opposition to the operations of American imperialism, which is very active in Ecuador as it is throughout Latin America. And this is you have growing social popular opposition. This is part of an international phenomenon. I think it's really at that to that social force that the defense of Assange really has to be directed. Not to because there's really a phenomenon, particularly here in the United States, the universal support for the persecution of Assange within the political establishment. But there is a social force that is emerging around the world. That the masses of workers are coming into opposition. And that's the real social foundation for the building of a movement that can free Assange. I think that's what you're beginning to see in Ecuador, and really has to be developed. The connection between the attack on Assange and the attack on the working class, and the defense of Assange and a political movement of the working class.
So what do you think, or how do you think a revolution similar to what happened in Ecuador could come about in America, whether it happened in the way there or in the nonviolent ways that we advocate for? What do you think would be like one of the things that could finally push us over the edge?
Well, I think that, we're talking about the growth of social mass opposition, and that can happen the United States is not unique in any, it's not, there's nothing which separates conditions here from conditions really in Ecuador, or of course in Puerto Rico, where we saw earlier this year a mass uprising in the US territory there. But the conditions of social inequality, the terrible conditions facing the vast majority of the population, this is producing immense social anger, no less in the United States than in Ecuador. And in fact, you're beginning to see now, it's perhaps not taking the same form in an immediate sense, but the growth of class struggle in America. The fact that you have a strike, although they're trying to shut it down, of tens of General Motors auto workers over the past month is immense significance. And then starting actually tomorrow, you'll have a strike of tens of thousands of teachers in Chicago. Now, it's the beginning of something, but it expresses a level of social opposition that exists in this country, which is not fundamentally different from Ecuador. And I think that is the future. The future is the sort of emergence into the political situation of broad masses of workers, of youth in social protests and struggles.
So we
I think
see
that's
a
a
lot.
great.
Oh,
Go ahead,
Taylor.
Andrew. Andrew, go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say, we see a lot everything portrayed as far as like revolutionary and radical ideologies. Not even that they're demonized by the mainstream media, because that's kind of like a blatantly obvious thing, but that they're put into boxes of political extremism. And if you believe this one thing, you are this far end of the spectrum supporter of this person. And if you believe this other thing, you're this other far end of the spectrum thing that supports this other person or idea. And like, this is something we've talked about on the show a lot, and it's the need to look past, at least to this point, political ideologies to organize for this more basic foundation of principles. Because if we lose our core concepts of free speech and the ability to express and associate, we lose the ability to have these discussions about what ideology would be best to govern our country, and lose the ability to try to get the masses on our side, whether it's for one team or the other, so to speak. So right now, I just think it's super interesting because you see like the typical red states are the ones that are starting a lot of these protests, and then they're bleeding over into what you would generally consider the more liberal areas, like the teacher strike in West Virginia, for example, how that immediately got resolved almost over the course of a very short period of time because they didn't want that to catch on. And so I think this general escalation that we have right now of more people getting in the protest sphere and unions standing up is great, but I hope it turns into more unionization, as well as forcing companies to become cooperatives and things like that, more so than just trying to get representative power.
So
Remember, Andrew, the teacher strike you were just talking about in West Virginia was because there were successful teacher strikes in Arizona and Oklahoma. And both of those states, as you pointed out, were also traditionally typically red states. What's wild to me is that the places that are supposed to be, liberal bastions are the ones where unions just get crapped on left and right and are nearly non-existent. And they're the ones that are on TV all the time because their attempts are getting shut down by the Democrats in power in their city. That's what I got for this.
yeah, so we do have a question in the chat. We have two actually for Jose. This first one is from Beth B. She says, Jose, do you think the people of Ecuador will catch on to Moreno's deception regarding canceling the decree? And if so, how long do you think it will take?
Well, the only way, because you see the commercial agreements, when a country signs on a commercial agreement, that's what the IMF agreement is. If the one party breaks the rules, he gets taken to court. And if a president comes and tries to break that, they will be taken to court, international court, where for sure we'll lose. You know, that's the state of the world today. Now, corporations, banks, they may sign contracts with one country, but then the court, a court hearing on any problem on that agreement does not take place in the country where where they signed the agreement with. They take it outside because they will win outside. Inside they will lose. So the international justice system, it has also been created to eliminate the justice in all countries of the world.
And then we also do have one more question for you. Um, this is from Propaganda, Quinn again, and he is wondering if there are any leaders to the movement and if the people have a list of demands from their government and from Lenin Moreno.
Yes, the agreement that brought back the gas prices, because they went 100%, for example, for diesel, and for gasoline, it was like 30%. They are back to the oil prices. But you see that leaders that signed that agreement have been collaborating with Lenin Moreno. And you wonder, well, why are they there? Well, they are there because their communities pushed them to go to protest. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to protest. Their communities push the leaders of the indigenous groups to go to protest. But guess what? Who signs the agreement? The leaders. And the communities have no idea that they signed no agreement, because that I do not agreement, because what Moreno did was just create a decree where it says that it will create another decree, and the decree that they signed is temporary.
So Joe, I want to get your thoughts in on what Jose was just discussing and referring to. Do you have any thoughts?
If I understood correctly, what he was saying was that there had been leaders which had been elected by the indigenous peoples, and they were sent, and they signed an agreement with Moreno, and that essentially sort of adapted to the government there and the repression, the people carrying out the repression. If I understood it correctly, is that what was being said, Jose?
Yes. Well, you see the indigenous groups. Well, you see, the thing is that Lenin Moreno said that he would agree to peace talks. Yeah. So he he uh, he gave the turning ball to the Indians. Now it's your ball. You see. And so the Indians had no choice but to say, yes, we will, we want this. We'll sign the agreement. So Lenin fooled them and made an agreement where it says that that this agreement is temporary and that he'll create another one. So if the leaders of the indigenous groups had left the meeting, Lenin Moreno would have accused them of having boycotted the peace deal. So he would have said, no, I want peace. And they are the ones who do not want peace. And he does that because the media, the private media, is in charge of, brainwashing the people into believing something that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that one of the things that's raised in all of the protests that have emerged over the past year, and there's been many of them, is the question of a political perspective for how to really carry them through to victory. I mean, if you look, for example, at the experience in Puerto Rico, where the mass uprising forced out the governor.
Joe, I think you may have cut out a little bit.
Remains, and now Oops.
Oh, you're back.
You're fine now. I'm
We
sorry.
got you.
Yeah, sorry, my internet connection's a little bit bad.
Happens to all of us.
The Wall Street remains, and I think you have similar issues in Ecuador, and also, of course, here in the United States. I mean, I think, I think we have to sort of identify what the real source of the problem is. One of the things I thought was very interesting in what you were saying, Jose, is the role of the United States in all this. And I think we have to begin talking about American imperialism. The role of American imperialism, whether you're talking about in the persecution of Assange, the CIA, the military, the intelligence agencies which are going after him, or the United States military and its role in Ecuador and throughout Latin America, in Puerto Rico, of course. That a fight against the horrific conditions all over the world, against the attack on democratic rights, really is a fight against American imperialism. And that's the American ruling class. I mean, that's the social system. If I could just, on this question of extremes, which was raised, I mean, we live in an era of extremes, extreme politics. And the extremes are coming first and foremost from the American government. I mean, we have a president who's out and out promoter of fascism. If you listen to the speeches of Donald Trump and what he's saying, denouncing far lefts and socialists as traitors, I mean, the rhetoric, the language, I mean, this is fascistic. The president of the United States, I mean, you want to talk about extremes, it's coming from the government. And of course, within this conflict in the world, you have on the other side the Democratic Party, which is the most fervent supporters of war. The war in Syria. This is, I mean, from the government. I mean, we live in extremes, and the real extremes, the real root of them is the social inequality, the social divide between a tiny oligarchy and the vast majority of the population. An oligarchy which is demanding austerity measures in Ecuador and is demanding further cuts against the working class here in the United States. So I think that, but it just strikes me in relationship to the developments in Ecuador that, what's really raised is the question which is facing everyone is what are we fighting against? What is the perspective and program to oppose the conditions that the masses face? And otherwise, one ends up sort of trying to find some sort of agreement or deal with the very people who are carrying out the repression, or trying to find somewhere within the political establishment here, some Democrat who's going to defend Julian Assange. And
So to try to localize that, that's actually a big problem that we have here in the state of Ohio, is the ability to just be superseded even under the vote of the popular will. And what I mean by that is, and in the best example, gerrymandering in the state of Ohio. There was a tireless group of people that worked their ass off to try to get like the most nonpartisan group to redraw the grid lines and to get Ohio turned into essentially like a fair voting state. And they got hundreds of thousands of signatures. They passed the ballot measure initially, like got it past all of the checks through the government and things like that, finally got it on the ballot. And then the state government says, well, you can't just pass it. Like, you have to now sit down and enter into collective negotiations with us for how we decide, how the people decide the borders get drawn for voting areas. So seeing that issue of the people you're trying to defeat having direct control over the way that they're defeated is something that's symbolic throughout every activist struggle flat out across the board. So I think that that's something that it's not just foreign issues, it's not just foreign policy, it's not just national issues, but even on local levels, it happens quite often.
Right. I do want to get, before we touch on the debates or the debate that took place last night, Jose, I do want to ask you, how do you see this crisis in Ecuador playing out? And I know you can't obviously predict exactly what happened, because I think that this situation is somewhat unpredictable, but how do you see the next few weeks going in Ecuador?
Well, as you know, we have a very intense political persecution right now. So, and the private media is quiet. The people don't know, and for example, the government said we are such person, and here's the evidence. But the private media, is in charge of convincing the people, that a receipt from a supermarket is evidence of crime. Today, they arrested one of our leaders. And what was the evidence? Several cards from a supermarket, a couple of receipts, 3 or 4 old phones, cellular phones that did not work anymore. That was the evidence. And what was the charge? Attempt to overthrow the government. So the political situation right now is extreme in Ecuador. He could spark another protest anytime. And the second protest, I think, is going to remove Lenin Moreno. But you cannot remove a president if he's not there. If he keeps changing, changing the government location to another place. How about if he moves it to a military base, which he did for a few days? How do you overthrow a government that is located within a military base? Those are questions, that I have no answer for. But you see, the problem is that he would have been overthrown already. But the problem is the media, the private media, keep him in power.
What are some good independent media sources out there that you guys have, or independent media sources that we in the US can watch to get accurate information about what's happening out there?
Social media. That's the only, we have nothing outside, because the ones that we had, they were all shut down.
So I don't want to ask for too many specifics because I don't want to get into that much detail about it. But throughout the last decade or so, we've seen the use of military forces and the shutting off of the internet and certain social media platforms used as a way to disorganize activists, and used as a way to kind of sow chaos and discord because the internet gets shut down or the communications platform gets shut down. And I don't want to ask too much of a specific question about this, but are you guys, I mean, you're obviously experiencing some type of pushback and issues on social media, but would you say you guys are seeing like a full-blown censorship campaign against you where accounts are just getting removed without terms and stuff like that we see here with some activists?
Uh, the sound is breaking up.
Oh, sorry.
Yesterday, one of the well-known social media places in Twitter who received threatening calls, and they told them that there is a list of activists that are going to be arrested.
So, has there been any talk about the need to secure internet infrastructure in particular areas? That way, the activists can continue to communicate, even if it's on some type of intranet form, where it's not necessarily with the whole world, but just maybe within a particular city or anything like that? Oh, I think you're breaking up bad on us, Jose.
Yes.
But can you hear us all right?
Yeah, you just came on again. It's
Okay.
been breaking up a lot.
Yeah, so the question was, and I guess to give it a little better context, you had talked about how they seized and essentially destroyed a news building that was pushing propaganda and pushing the Moreno agenda. Do you see potentially any seizure of internet infrastructure in the future if censorship or internet shutdowns get too bad?
If but their, their method is usually, threats all the time, threats. And then they, take it to a higher level, to another level, until they get arrested or they just kill them. So that's the stage. We are now in the threats level. Did you understand me?
Yeah, you said you're now in the threat level with it.
No, we are in level 1, let's say. On level 1 is threats only. Next level is a little bit more threatening.
Okay, because I had seen some videos of like snipers and stuff being dropped off on buildings and like restocking going on with them as they were moving personnel from rooftop to rooftop using military helicopters.
Yes.
Can you speak to that? Like, was that accurate? And could you kind of talk to about some of the
Yes,
tactics you saw them using?
it was a military that was doing that, and they are the military are trained to fight the enemy, but the enemy is always supposed to be a foreign enemy, like an invasion. There, but what happened in the soldier's mind to you know is enemy with people, their own people. It beats my mind.
Well, we saw the same language being used by Tiger Swan, the private security company that uh, was it Energy Transfer Partners hired for the pipeline going through Standing Rock. And a bunch of their internals were leaked from a member of Tiger Swan to the Intercept, and they published those. And in that, the description of the people who had a right to the land and the people who showed up to defend the people who had a right to the land were referred to as enemies. They assigned uh people that would infiltrate the camps targets, and they would recruit assets, and it was all the exact same spook speak or military speak. And these are again fellow citizens and first citizens. So it's that kind of thing is certainly universal, but it speaks to a massive level of dehumanization and desensitization that takes place in order to get a soldier to that level.
No, you must realize that most of the people that join the military, they start very young, innocent. They enter the military 18, 19. They're very innocent. So they brainwashing them inside. That's what they do. So after 5, 6 years, they already, programmed to kill anybody.
Oh
Do you
yeah,
guys have a volunteer military force or do you have mandatory military service? Did you hear me okay, Jose?
No,
Do you
no, I didn't hear it.
do you guys have a volunteer military or do you have mandatory military service?
Volunteer.
Volunteer? Okay.
The young will join because they need a job.
Because we've actually seen here in the US press recently, and maybe this is something that Joe could talk to a little bit, about how the levels of wealth and income inequality are actually a driving force behind military recruitment. where they're finding that people aren't joining for love of country or need for conflict or because they believe in all the foreign wars, but they're joining actually because of mass amounts of student debt. So could you talk a little bit, Joe, about how imperialistic societies in general, or even just the United States, create, or how they create these systems to force people into like enlisting in military service?
I, I need to leave.
Jose,
So,
did you say you need to leave?
yes, please.
Okay, I want to thank you so much for coming on the stream this evening. We all really do appreciate that, and we commend you for your great work, and you know, just sending lots of support from the United States, from all of us here. We truly mean that, and we truly support you in everything that you are doing. Are there any last thoughts that you want to end with before you do head out?
Well, before I leave, I did want to say that Twitter made a big free speech violation when they added the feature of hiding the comments.
You're absolutely right about that.
Yep.
It's, yeah, blatant public censorship.
Because that comes on the heels of a court case that happened earlier this year that said politicians and people of like political influence and national importance can't block people on social media. And I think that came out of the Eastern District or somewhere in the northeastern US. So that's something too that's their way now because some judge told them no. Well, now we can hide comments and not block people. So that's something that probably won't stand up in court if challenged. But I do want to just thank you, Jose, for coming on. But he's already left with us. So I
Jose,
think
oh, he left.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to make note though, Jose. If he does see this later, you're getting so much support from our viewers in the chat. Propaganda says, "We love you, Jose. Love from Canada." Karen M said, "Great guest," but she and also Free Thinker 59 said, "Thank you, Jose, and thank you for coming on." And from Beth B as well. So you're getting a lot of support from our viewers in the chat. And thank you so much again for joining us. I know you're not here. He checked out already, but that was Jose. And he was just discussing with us the current crisis in Ecuador and how he sees that playing out in the future. But we will kind of switch gears now. I know that we wanted to, of course, touch on some topics in the news, but I think that it's important that we do touch on the debates. You know, it's something that we dread having to watch sometimes, but we do want to touch on the debates, of course, because it is important to be discussing some of the craziness or weirdness that took place last night. But before that, I know you, Andrew, have a something you wanted to bring up before we did get to that.
yeah. So Joe had mentioned this a little earlier, and it's something that I think is super important. Could you talk a little bit about the union strikes that are going on right now? You brought up like the UAW, and if you could talk just about them in general or them specifically, that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, there's been a whole series of strikes. I think, you know, first, their significance is that they do express a level of social anger, which is building up within the United States, or has built up over really decades, is now is beginning to take open form. I think that though it's really critical to understand is that the unions, I mean, to call them union strikes, I mean, the unions as institutions actually work and have worked systematically to isolate and suppress the class struggle. You look like a union like the United Auto Workers. I mean, it's a very sort of strange situation because the UAW is supposedly organizing and negotiating on behalf of the workers, even as it's embroiled in a corruption scandal in which it's been exposed as a bribe tool of the companies, getting, you know, in fact, billions of dollars through these corrupt corporatist schemes that they've set up since the mid 80s. and you have top union executives who are being investigated and or indicted in the midst of all this.
So I have a friend who's a union organizer. He's an apprentice right now in
Thanks.
one of the local unions out here. And he actually tried to get involved in there. You cut out, so I just kind of picked up. I apologize for
Sorry,
cutting
yeah,
you off, Joe.
no problem.
But I have a friend who's a union organizer out here, or a union member trying to join the actual union organizing force behind their politics, because right now it's just a bunch of old men. And when he took an idea to them, like, hey, I want to support this particular candidate who was still like a mainstream duopoly candidate, wanted to organize for her within the union and things like that. They literally told the political director, the man who's supposed to wield the organizing power behind the union, told him, well, you're going to have to talk to the business director to make sure that everyone we do work for is okay with supporting them. And my response was, that's not how a union works. Like the political director should be directly at odds with that business director, because
Oh man, the SEIU in California has for decades now just been the, I guess, the battering ram for management. And they heavily control. Sorry, I had a gnarly work day and I just got a massive Charlie horse in my quadricep there. That was fun. They massively control the state Democratic Party. The starting realistically, the beginning of the 50s, we had this sort of slow developing cozy relationship between union bosses and management, and it blew up, as Joe was saying, in the 80s, but with what, 10.9% total nationwide union membership now. We've got a situation where the bosses are negotiating to the workers on behalf of management. And that's or in most cases, like, there's still some good unions out there. The IBEW in particular seems to be pretty damn good, and of course the Major League Baseball Players Union. But it's backwards. It's completely backwards from where it needs to be, and it's so goddamn frustrating.
Well, and I would, if I could just add on, I mean, I think the question of the Democratic Party and their political alliance with the Democratic Party is really a critical element. The unions are their political, and that goes back actually to what you were saying, the 1950s, when actually the merger of the AFL and the CIO in 1955, but it was based on the purging of the unions of the socialists, of anyone of a left radical character, and it was based on a political alliance with the Democratic Party and support for capitalism. And I would just actually make one point about the current situation as well. The Chicago Teachers Union is currently being led by someone named Jesse Sharkey, who's the president of the CTU. The last time I was here on this call, we were talking about what I called the pseudo-left and the role of groups like the ISO and the DSA in supporting U.S. war drive, and in fact supporting the persecution of Assange and creating the political conditions for doing that. Jesse Sharkey is a former member of the ISO. The ISO dissolved earlier this year, but it's supposedly a left, but he's doing the same thing in Chicago, leading the CTU now, as was done by Karen Lewis, who preceded him. And they want to try to shut the strike down that's starting tomorrow as quickly as possible. They're very close to the Democratic Party establishment in Chicago, which of course is the Obama's hometown, and they are, the unions work to suppress opposition in the working class to the extent possible. They are seeking to isolate and shut down those struggles which emerge. The fact that the auto worker strike has lasted over a month is an expression of the fact that they felt that they couldn't get through a contract. They're very worried about it. That's what happened in 2015. They had a contract which was defeated by Fiat Chrysler workers. And you talk to an auto worker, the level of hostility to the UAW is universal. Everyone hates this organization and sees it as a corrupt tool of management. But the question is of developing independent organizations, and I think it's really critical for the development of the class struggle and critical for resolving everything. It talks about the fight against war, the fight against social inequality, the defense of democratic rights. That really depends on the development of a movement in the working class, and that means creating a new structures that through which workers can actually unify and fight back.
So speaking of democratic rights, and to kind of pivot this a little bit, last night we basically had one of the greatest circle jerks for why billionaires want to take the guns away. And I know that sounds like a weird statement to say, but that was the thing that stuck with me the most. I heard the debate in passing a lot, and I'll kind of get into what I experienced last night. But when I heard two people arguing, one of them saying, well, you don't have an actual plan. Here's my plan for how we're going to take guns away. Literally all I could think of is this is a CIA agent and a former Cult of the Dead Cow member arguing back and forth about the best way to disarm the US population while we're at peak political corruption for not the first time, but for the first open time in this period where it's pretty much all out on the table if you're willing to look at it. So I would kind of be interested in your thoughts, Joe, about all the neoliberals and neoconservatives actually trying to disarm the American populace right now.
Well, I think that, I actually think that the most significant element of the debate last night was the universal support for the war in Syria. And, rather than the question of disarming the population, obviously that's an issue, but I think that, what was most significant was the fact that you had all of these Democratic Party politicians declaring that the basis of their opposition to the Trump administration was support for US military operations in the Middle East, which is an extraordinary fact and it creates a situation where Trump, is, you're talking about the all volunteer army before, and the fact that you have now sort of conscription or economic conscription into the US military, which I think is an important fact. There's a Time magazine, I believe, published a lead article in its latest edition on the forever wars, and it was highlighting the plight of soldiers in Afghanistan who are going on numerous tours, and how the horrific impact of these wars. And you have a situation where the Democratic Party is seeking to criticize the Trump administration from the standpoint of its failure to be sufficiently committed to US military operations in the Middle East. And that was expressed in the debate. So everyone from Biden to Sanders had the same line on this question. And they are, they're really going on the offensive on this question. It creates a situation where Trump is able to posture as the anti-war candidate. He's tweeting about how the United States has to end these endless wars. This arch war, he was, passed the largest military budget. It was threatened to annihilate countries all over the world. And the Democrats create a situation where, he is able to present himself as the candidate who's going to bring the troops home, which is very popular. I think that was actually a significant factor in his election last time was the fact that the population identified Clinton as the more pro-war candidate.
For the
So
record, though,
that's what I thought.
that hasn't happened. Though we just sent 2,800 troops to Saudi Arabia on top of the 3,000 that we sent 3 weeks ago. Barack Obama dropped a bomb every 20 minutes. Donald Trump is currently dropping a bomb every 12 minutes. Like he came out after John Bolton quit fired, swinging his little peepee around, going, Bolton wasn't going deep enough on Venezuela, and I wanted to take him out, and John Bolton was a pussy. He wouldn't let me. Like that was Trump's response to it. And if the people are just distracted or impaired enough to believe that Donald Trump is somehow an anti-war candidate. Like that's a bill of goods that I mean, who can
I would say that the
take
Democrats,
ownership for that? It's a not we're in fucking 15 proxy wars in Africa. We're destabilizing Guatemala again. We're destabilizing Nicaragua again. Donald Trump is a warmongering imperialist.
Steve, what you're saying is absolutely no, what you're saying is absolutely true. However, I don't think that it helps Trump significantly when the Democrats are creating an environment where he can pull off this facade
Of
of being this anti war candidate, this anti war politician. They are making it very easy for him to pass along as doing so, which I agree with Joe. And that I think that's one of the factors that really got him elected too, because these wars are really unpopular. But
So one
in
of the
reality, he's able to hide behind that, and they help him.
My point in saying that was mostly because you never hear that stuff even on independent media.
You're right. You're right.
So we had been trying to pressure Tulsi Gabbard in a couple different ways to actually bring up WikiLeaks and bring up Julian Assange during the debates. And the Syria issue would have been the number one issue to bring it up in, because in all of the talk, with everything happening behind the scenes, with the intelligence community being exposed on a pretty regular basis for being just the hideous monsters that they are, Jimmy Dore actually talked about this, to where she answered the questions on Syria well enough, but didn't provide a full statement or description of what she was actually trying to say, I think, or what she should have said, which is WikiLeaks actually exposed how the US intelligence agencies, with their private contractors, used social media as a way to start the Syrian revolution to begin with. And that's something that's never brought up, it's never talked about. And then when there's a candidate who claims to support WikiLeaks standing on stage, she won't bring that up. She won't say Julian Assange and WikiLeaks showed us US intelligence communities started this war that we then later got into. So for me, that was a really big point of frustration. Is she released the 6-minute video about, oh, this is all I got to say. And in no part of it did she actually address the person who pointed out all of these issues for all of this information that we know. With everything from Syria to the problems with Donald Trump, to where no one on stage said, well, Hillary Clinton and the Pied Piper emails showed us that they gave us Donald Trump, that they picked Donald Trump to run against Hillary Clinton. So why don't we get the neoliberal corporatists out of our party, so that way we don't get another Donald Trump, because they have to find someone more unelectable than a war criminal.
She
So I think,
also called out the mainstream media on another point and didn't bring up WikiLeaks or Julian Assange. And that would have been a really good point to pivot into calling out the mainstream media and then talking about politically persecuted journalist Julian Assange in Belmarsh prison. And so, yeah, that she had multiple chances, I think, even though she did not have a lot of time, she was not given a lot of time to speak. There did feel like there were multiple chances she could have brought him up, and yeah, multiple times saying WikiLeaks is the outfit that has shown us this corruption, not only in the DNC, you know, rigging the primary, the election in 2016. I felt like if she would have kind of fully gone on that rant of calling out the DNC corruption, WikiLeaks fits right into that. And it was disappointing to see her not bring them up at all.
When she had the longest she spent talking about any one thing was about how important it is, or the most important job a president has is commander in chief. And she was slamming Trump for not being the kind of military leader that she would be. And she used the phrase regime change wars over and over and over again, which bugs the shit out of me, because all wars are regime change wars.
you can even hear the way she inflects it, that it's a think tank talking point, because it's regime change wars. It's the only word in her vocabulary that is formed differently. And that's something that, like, I would love to see the marketing and the test marketing and all of that shit that the Council on Foreign Relations put out behind it. because it's huge. Like she says, regime change war. She's not talking about the war on terrorism. She's not talking about defending poppy plants in Afghanistan. She is talking about specific regime change.
And that's even vague in itself, just using that phrase, because she's not pointing out specific
Right, like
wars
the
or
shadow
previous
wars in Africa.
conflicts. Exactly. And another point too is that I think she also she did have multiple chances to bring up WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, especially with her calling out of the media, but she took that opportunity to address the smears that were made against her. And I understand why she would want to use that time to address those smears. But I think that it was disappointing to not see her really stand up for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks when she did so pretty publicly before. But I do not think that she gained anything from threatening to boycott the debates, because it of course never came up. We knew that the mainstream media wasn't going to address it during the debate. She never addressed DNC corruption. So I think that was a weird move to me. Don't you guys think? I mean, I thought that was really strange, because I don't think there was anything to be gained from that. Joe, what do you think about that? Or I'm sorry, Christy, if you want to.
Oh, no, I
add
was
something.
just going to say, I had talked last week when she announced about potentially not going to the debates, that it was maybe some sort of media PR move to give her the support from her fan base to really bring that up during the debates last night. And yeah, I agree that was, not touched upon, and it felt like a missed opportunity, specifically because she had threatened not to go.
If I could just make one point, which I think is that, if I can be straightforward, I think we should stop being disappointed or, what's the other word, frustrated by the actions of Democratic Party politicians. I think we should accept the Democratic Party for what it is, and not, sort of, because I think it's because if we're disappointed, it means that we expected something from these people. I mean, whether it's Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard now, I mean, these are Democratic Party politicians. They've got a certain line, and Gabbard's line. I mean, there are divisions also within the political establishment, and there's concerns, and Trump reflects this, concerns over the impact of some of the wars they've launched and the disasters that it's produced. And one of Trump's aims is to perhaps remove troops from Syria in order to redirect them against, maybe it's against Iran, or maybe it's against China, in a different war, in a bigger war. And there are differences within within the political establishment, but it's not, if we're expecting these politicians to behave in a principled way and get up there and make statements about, Assange and the defense of Assange or Manning, and they're not going to do it because they're operating within a political framework. They're Democratic Party politicians. Bernie Sanders hasn't said anything about this, not because it's a mistake. It's because this is what he is as a political figure. It's what the party that he represents is. And I just think that the orientation, it gets back to some of the earlier issues. The orientation shouldn't be to them. I mean, that's the Democratic Party. Is that this is bourgeois politics. This is what it is. The orientation, in my view, it has to be to a different social force, and it has to be to the workers, to the young people, to the people who are beginning to fight. I mean, going out to these protests in Ecuador and talking about Assange and why the defense of Assange is so critical, I think would be very important. Or going out and speaking to teachers about why the defense of Assange is critical to the defense of educating the public. I'm sure one gets a big response on that question, because it's that social force. It's going to have real commitment to democratic rights, not the Democratic Party, which has no commitment to democratic rights, which is engaging in censorship, which is spearheading the campaign against WikiLeaks, against Assange, which has said nothing about Chelsea Manning, who's been in jail for months as well. I mean, this is the party. This is what it is. Anyway, that's.
And I don't mean to say that I put my faith into a former Council on Foreign Relations member, but we were trying to create a space. And for those who don't know kind of what we had done, myself, Jorge, and Sam are actually previous Vigil members or attendees. We went out Sunday night and put up about 200, 300 signs, and they were 15 feet up on poles. And that was me on my tiptoes on the top of a step ladder being spotted by one friend while the other one held onto the ladder so I didn't just completely bail and our goal was to create a space with that. And then Chavista Misty, she actually went out on Tuesday on the debate day and put up, oh, I don't know the exact number, but it was probably somewhere around 100 to 150 more flyers or signs, and they all got removed. Like, we had attempted to create this space with the idea that, well, someone has to talk about this. And if we can make this space and have our voices get heard and push it out through independent media to the candidates that people generally think are predisposed to respond to what they consider leftist pressure. And that's just not the case. Like, with everything that we put into going into Tuesday to try to just get one man's name brought up in a whole conversation that he had influenced for the last 20 years or 13 years, it just shows that these people aren't heroes. And it goes back to Susie Dawson's larger point that she made towards the end of the Unity for J vigils. People will use Julian's name to gain power. It's what Donald Trump has done. And I don't want to say that Tulsi is a good or a bad actor, because quite frankly, I don't care. Because she's, at the end of the day, playing the game of power. And if we have the come from behind victory of the former Council on Foreign Relations member who's been in full support of drone strikes for the last decade as the nominee, that doesn't put us any closer to world peace. That doesn't put us any closer to ending the oligarchy. That just puts someone that we're comfortable with at the head of it, just like Barack Obama did.
If all we're going to do is change the optics on imperialism, and that's all you get to do, voting in a rigged system inside a duopoly, then I I don't know what it's going to take to get more people to be aware of the fact that you can't vote your way out of an oligarchy. You can't legislate your way out of an oligarchy. That's not how this works. If you have at all been watching Susie Dawson's series, you've seen the breakdown of how information is controlled, who gets it after the fact, and politicians are pretty low on the ladder for that. This is happening at a level where politicians are essentially functioning as the public relations firm for global intelligence and the businesses that they've been able to buy, influence, control, or block. That's it. That's what they do. They're public relations. And if we can't collectively, eh, outside of, or using government as the absolute last resort, using the ballot box as the absolute last resort, if we can't collectively assemble to demand our power back, we're going to continue down this path of electing an optically better imperialist every 4 years or 8 years.
Or an optically worse imperialist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, better for 26 to 40% of the country and worse for the rest, but because it's not a one person, one vote thing, or 46% of the country has said there's no point. Yeah,
But
yeah.
in a
I
way,
get what you're saying.
but in a way too, there is almost really no point because in voting, at least, because we know, and the reason I'm saying that is because we know that the intelligence agencies, of course, run everything, and that the politicians, like you were saying, Steve, are like the PR firm for this. And it's really an illusion to make it seem as if we do have a democratic process and that we can't actually elect our leaders. But in reality, I think this is all, predetermined well in advance. And I think that's also uh, another thing that we're seeing happen here is when outsiders kind of try to join into the system, they're met with great hostility for doing so. So we've been talking a lot about tonight how we can initiate some change, which is a big point of these vigils. Joe, how do you see us really changing the dynamics in the United States and kind of pulling back our influence and meddling in other countries' affairs?
Well, I think the dynamic in the United States is changing, but it's changing because there's a different social force which is emerging, which has been so long suppressed. In 2017, we wrote a statement on the Web World Socialist website called Palace Coup or Class Struggle, the political strategy, the conflict in Washington and the political strategy of the working class, in which we analyzed the character of the Democratic Party conflict with the Trump administration. We defined it as a conflict within the ruling elite. And we said that a different social force is on the horizon, that mass social struggles are on the agenda. Well, they're not any longer on the agenda. They're actually already happening and expanding. We're just pointing to a few of them. And it is an international process. But what is the characteristic feature of the past year is the emergence of mass social struggles. And that's, a force which is going to change everything. The fact that masses of people are intervening into the course of history is going to change the whole political dynamic, and it will upend all the calculations of the ruling elite, their strategy. And I think that is the social force that we have to turn to for the defense of basic democratic rights. I think in that context, really having a clear understanding of the Democratic Party is really critical. The question of the impeachment, I think, came up earlier in the stream. Someone was raising, if you could list in an order, the issues upon which Trump should be removed, and you said, if we're going to wage it on the basis of these issues, from the most progressive to the most reactionary, the Democrats went down that list and they picked the most reactionary basis upon which to wage their opposition to Trump possible. Support for war, support for the CIA. I mean, that's their slogan, all the way with the CIA. If they could have a banner, that would be what it would read. That's what the Democrats chose to do. And it expresses and this is in the impeachment as well. I mean, why are they focusing on Ukraine? Because it's on the questions of foreign policy that they are focused. And that's what they want to keep it contained to. They made very clear it's going to be about foreign policy, it's going to be about the Ukraine call, and that's it. There's not going to be any of the other issues and many, many reasons why this government should be removed. That's not what the impeachment is going to be about. And they may end up failing. I think there's going to be two outcomes possible of this. One is that the impeachment drive fails, and Trump is going to emerge strengthened from this. And he's making a popular appeal on the question of war. He'll emerge strengthened. His strategy of creating a far-right dictatorship in this country will be strengthened. The second is that they succeed, and what do you have then? Mike Pence, or a government even more beholden to the interests of the military and the intelligence agencies? I mean, either way, it's a defeat for the working class. So I think, though, what is going to change it is that the workers, the masses of young people, they intervene on the basis of their own independent interests, not let themselves be, and the issues that they're raising be confined to the political establishment, to what the bourgeois politicians think is acceptable.
Right. And I thought it was really interesting last night, and it stuck out to me, unsurprising though at the same time, was that they prefaced a question, one of the moderators did, with the American intelligence community says X, and then they asked a question about it. I thought that was really interesting. I can't remember exactly what point they made.
So I wanna define for a minute, because you actually brought up a point that no one talks about, Joe. So I really appreciate that, because you kind of give me the space here to bring this up. Defining the two warring factions of the oligarchy right now. And the way I would put it is Trump is part of the Anglo-American faction that started World War I to repress the power of Germany to continue the English authority throughout the world with the enforcement of the US military. So that's kind of where like Trump and some of the Republican base are, and that Anglo-American elite trying to rebuild that order, essentially. And then you have your neoliberal corporatists who Barack Obama best defined in his speech at the Nelson Mandela Day event. And I think it was in 2017 or 2018, where he said, the new class of aristocrats don't have a loyalty to a nation or to a people, and they're willing to pay bribes, they're willing to steal, cheat, just to be able to get ahead because it's an intrinsic part of our system. And so I think being able to recognize those two separate factions that still want to maintain their economic dominance over the world as the two factions that we're seeing kind of go at each other's throats right now. And it's presented in the media in such a way that they don't create outrage about the actual social issues. They create outrage about going after other members of the establishment, to where you see the only reason Ukraine's in the news is because Trump talked about Joe Biden's son. If Trump had brought up funding the neo-Nazis that we had did originally to overthrow the Ukrainian government, there wouldn't have been an CIA release from a insider at the White House. It would have just been, hey, this guy's doing the work that we started. So I think that that's really interesting to point out, is the two distinct factions of the oligarchy that just want to maintain control over the population while warring with each other to do so.
Well, I think that the conflicts within the ruling class are complex, and the questions of foreign policy in terms of, what are the issues motivating it. I think in some ways Trump represents the classic America firsters, and the orientation of that tendency has generally been, on the one hand, to Latin America and on the other to Asia. I think if there's one element which has defined the sort of Trump, it has been the focus on China. And there is to some extent, I think he sees the pulling out of the Middle East or improving relations with Russia as a means of focusing attention on China. Whereas this faction, which is dominant in the foreign policy establishment, sees the going after Russia as a precondition for really taking on China, and that control over the Middle East is critical. So there are conflicts over these questions. There's no peace faction within this ruling establishment. I thought one of the other interesting elements of the debate last night was the Ellen question at the end. There's sort of the ridiculous character of it, but the answer was interesting, which no one's really talking about, in which three of the candidates, including Bernie Sanders, declared that their great friend, which people would be surprised at, was John McCain, the arch warmonger. You actually have somewhat of a coming together of the Democratic Party and the neoconservatives. It's worth noting, by the way, that the neocons actually came out of the Democratic Party. They came out of the Democratic Party and on the question of the war and support for Vietnam, and they came out of the Democratic Party, Scoop Jackson, and as well as the Shachtmanites, by the way, at that time, which is another question of the history of the socialist movement. But they came out of the Democratic Party, they went into the Republicans. And now you have a sort of phenomenon where they're going back into the Democratic Party. But these are conflicts within the ruling class, they're conflicts within the state, in which all agree with the basic strategy. And again, I think the question is for workers to develop an independent orientation. And that means connecting the fight against war, the defense of democratic rights, to the social issues, as you're saying. The great social issues confronting the vast. What would a real opposition to Trump be waged on? His attack on immigrants, his attack on the working class, his tax cuts for the wealthy, his assault on Medicare, on food stamps. That's really the basis that a social movement against Trump and the whole ruling class has to be rooted.
And something too with the support of immigrants.
People are asking who our guest is, and I want to make note of that just real quick, Andrew, and then you go ahead. So he's in our chat. Joe, everybody's really loving what you're saying right now. Our guest this evening, he's been on before, is Joe Kishore, and he is a writer for the World Socialist website. Many people were asking, so I wanted to make sure I got that out there. Andrew, you could go ahead now.
So one of the things too, and this is kind of a controversial thing to say, I guess, for all the things that we say on this show. I don't think DACA was designed for the way that they sold it to the American public. And I think what the strategy was behind it is a lot of what you saw kind of in Nazi Germany, getting people to self-register or identify as certain groups, to where you had a president who stepped in, who became the deporter in chief, but he got millions of people that were trying to hide under the radar and still function as Americans to register and put themselves on a government list. And then as soon as the administration changes, that list goes away. And now all of those people are being tracked and monitored. The government has their addresses and places of employment that they were using to previously verify why they believed they had earned the citizenship that they should have earned originally. So I think it was really just a horribly dark way to try to trick undocumented immigrants into putting themselves on government watch lists, essentially, because now that DACA's gone, that's all that that turned into.
I feel the same way about medical marijuana cards and disarmament. And because at least here in California, and I know in a number of other states, if you're a medical marijuana patient, you're supposed to surrender your firearms. And that goes down to like a freaking 22 plinker. Oh, I think you're allowed a varmint gun, maybe. But like, you know, it's ridiculous. It's that's an incredible point. I I saw something in the chat that I wanted. Oh yeah, I think it was about what we thought about impeachment. I just want to say this real quick. I think I've addressed this once or twice on my show, but the House can convict him, or the House can, do whatever it is that they get to do, but it's a Republican majority in the Senate. All they have to do when it gets to the Senate is dismiss the charges. Like it would be up to Mitch McConnell to take it forward. I don't see that happening at all. Like, there's already a giant stack of symbolic do nothing bills on Mitch McConnell's desk that he hasn't even taken a look at for, I don't know, since the beginning of last calendar year. I think it's a pure, I mean, it's always a political act. You can't send someone to prison over impeachment. But this is a particularly, uh, I don't know, hacky political act. And Joe's right. Out of all the legitimate things you could go after Trump for, going after him because he broke decorum and did over the phone what your ambassadors are supposed to do, or what your Secretary of State is supposed to do, not right out there in the open. That's what the Democrats chose to go after him for. And it speaks to, I don't know, I guess the um yeah, I don't know, the weird games that elites
Well,
play.
it speaks to the
I
real
guess.
social interests that the Democrats actually represent. I mean, what they've chosen to base the impeachment on is driven by the actual interests of what they. I mean, the thing about the Democratic Party also is that they are constantly terrified of stirring anything up. And they operate with one hand tied behind they're constantly looking behind their shoulders, worried that anything that they might do will lead to a social explosion in this country, and that people will get involved. So everything is behind the scenes, behind, in closed rooms and closed testimony to go. They don't want anything because they know that this country is a social powder keg. It really is. I mean, the level of anger is just enormous.
And earned.
Well, about the phone call too, that was the first question that they addressed last night, was on this whistleblower issue. However, they failed to even acknowledge whistleblower rights or whistleblowers in general, which I thought was really interesting. I actually thought for a moment there, the optimistic side of me was thinking that maybe they were going to bring up whistleblower rights and how we treat whistleblowers. They did not. Nobody brought it up. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But back to the actual nature of this this phone call, I think it's a really easy sell, and Democrats see that, because we know that they're very much clinging to the Russiagate, which we talk about all the time. But this sort of is a very convenient thing for them to try to sell the American public. I think this whole idea of collusion, or
do you think this
working
will
with the foreign
play
government.
into Trump's hands because, you know, we're in an election cycle and the current government is so obsessed with impeaching him and not addressing issues that the American people need help on, whether that's healthcare, student loan debt, climate change, all the things that we want to talk about in our election debates. You know, do you see this as sort of Trump using this as sort of, well, the Democrats don't care about you. The Democrats don't care about your issues. They just want to attack me. They just want to impeach me. Do you see that, what the connection I'm making there?
Absolutely, that's what he's going to do. Absolutely, and I think that's more likely outcome of it. You know, and he has a strategy, Trump. He has a strategy. He's making a fascistic appeal. He's going after immigrants. You know, and you listen to his speeches. You know, it's really, you know, he has a conception, and his greatest, and he understands the Democratic Party. He knows that the Democrats will not make a popular appeal. They won't. I mean, what would if the Democrats went out and said, we're going to have mass rallies, demonstrations against this government, you know, this criminal government, which is responsible for this, and this, you know, this is what it's doing. We're, you know, any of these people, if any of the people on the debate last night said, I am calling on you, the American people, we are going to have a one-day general strike against this government. I want everyone to go to Washington, D.C. today or this day, and we're going to, you know, that would get a response. And you know, we're going to call this on the basis of the fight against social inequality, you know, the fight to defend healthcare, the fight, you know, this is the issues, the fight against the attack on immigrants, you know, and make an appeal. But they don't because, and Trump knows that. So he's going out and having these fascistic rallies while the Democrats are having their, you know, their closed door hearings. And I think the more likely outcome is that Trump will be strengthened by it. If the working class doesn't intervene independently, Trump will be strengthened. If there's one party that can lead to the second election of Donald Trump, it's the Democratic Party. And it's worth recalling that Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million. He's an illegitimate president. You know, but the Democratic Party, you know, is constantly proceeding on the basis of not wanting to rile up opposition. And Trump knows that, and he bases his political strategy on that.
So I haven't seen a lot of the Project Veritas leaks, but it's something that they did start a series where they're exposing CNN. And in the first part of it, like the first big, I think it was like almost 15-minute video that they released, the insider was talking or was on the phone call or talking with one of the night shift directors. Yeah, I was talking with one of the night shift directors. And he was talking about how there's literally just the media created this monster, that they allowed this to happen, and that it just built from there. And that now that he's in this position, they're profiting like crazy trying to fight him. And it literally laid out the case for the Pied Piper strategy and for what Julian Assange had exposed the DNC for doing with their own words from CNN at that point, not even just from their own words in their emails. And no one brings that up ever. And you never see a Democrat say, hey, well, why don't we stop propping up hardcore far-right candidates so we can run against them and lose? Like, that's never talked about.
Yeah. By the way, just because you mentioned this point about the DACA, if you read the World Socialist website articles, when DACA was passed, we made this point about the danger that was going to come. You know, people were registering, and that, you know, when the policy shifted. You know, but yeah, I mean, this is the character of this. I think the sort of the main thing is that they are terrified of social opposition. One of the commenters raised the question of socialism, smearing and demonization of the very word socialism. It seems to be an effective campaign to smear the concept of human interdependence. If I could just quickly respond to that point, because I think that actually socialism now is very popular, particularly among young people. It's very, very popular. And it's becoming more popular, and people have an experience with capitalism. Of course, they identify socialism and go after it. And I think the very fact that Trump has very clearly identified that the main enemy is socialism, is the far left. That's what he keeps going on and on about. He is making a appeal. I mean, because he's making a certain appeal to, having these fascistic rallies, but his main appeal is actually to the military and to the financial oligarchy, as you were saying. Because he's saying, look, the main threat you have is socialism. It's the growth of opposition to social inequality. It's the fact that the policies that you are implementing are deeply unpopular, whether it's war or bailouts of the banks and bailouts of Wall Street or new attacks on the working class and new attacks on social programs, that this is unpopular, and that there's going to be opposition to these policies and opposition to capitalism. And he's saying to the financial oligarchy, I'm your man to go after this and to oppose it. That's the sort of, but I think actually socialism is going to be a very popular program. People, socialism is opposition to the present system. It's opposition to war. It's opposition to social inequality. It's opposition to oligarchy, the attack on democracy. That is socialism. And I think that, it's an idea whose time has come. It's finally necessary for us to stop avoiding the basic issue, which is confronting the world's population, which is the capitalist system. That's really the question. And to the extent that we really identify and go after it, and that the problem is capitalism, it's the fact that the whole world economy is run by a tiny layer of the corporate and financial elite. That's the problem. The vast majority is exploited by a tiny few. To the extent we identify that and build a movement on that, I think it will become very, very, very popular.
Unfortunately, I think the term socialism too has been heavily associated with negativity overwhelmingly throughout American history. Even if you look at like cartoons, or even like kids' cartoons, or even the media in general, entertainment, they tend to tie, communism, socialism with this horrible negative thing. And I think it's going to take a lot of efforts to get the majority of people to kind of see it differently and to kind of rewire their thought process when it comes to what socialism is and what it really means. Because I think there's still many misconceptions attached to it, which you had alluded to. But this is also the same thing for Julian Assange's case. Of course, the term WikiLeaks, the name WikiLeaks, Julian Assange's name in general, has been so heavily tied to negativity that it's something we really have to rewire people to think differently. But on that note of Julian Assange, there is some expected court dates coming up. Christy, I want you to kind of address that and what we could expect this upcoming week.
Yeah, so there was a brief court hearing October 11th, so this past Friday morning. Julian Assange did appear at this specific court date on the video link. So it was very brief, and all that he spoke to was he gave his name and his birth date. There were some free Assange supporters that were able to get into the courtroom. When the court hearing has him for a video link set up, there's only about 10 spots for press or supporters or families to get in. So it's a very tight room. And the statement that we saw Friday morning was supporters saying, "We were shocked at the deterioration of his appearance." So we didn't really get any court sketches or anything of the video link. But for supporters who had seen him before in video link hearings, that's a pretty big statement. So we don't know any more details really than that. But coming up on October 21st, Julian Assange is expected to make an appearance in person for the next case management hearing. Friday morning, or later on Friday, the Courage Foundation did put out a statement and said there will be a fuller court appearance taking place on Monday, October 21st. This is the first opportunity for a number of important issues in the case to be raised. So they will be talking about more of, I think, the schedule of things to take place. We've heard before things will kick off in February of 2020. So yeah, we are expecting Julian Assange to make an appearance, and we are wanting to encourage anybody who lives in London or can get to London on the 21st to get down to Westminster Magistrates Court and show support, show solidarity, and make some noise, bring signs, so that we can really show the press, who hopefully will be there as well, how much support Julian really does have.
Yeah, this is he's been appearing in court via video link. So that's what makes this a little bit differently, in addition to what you had been mentioning. So yeah, I think everybody should just keep an eye out for what happens on October 21st. That is this upcoming Monday. And like Christy was saying, if you are in UK and if you are in the London area, do make a point to show up. And there's plenty of events that you can participate in. And I know Christy will be retweeting that out. All of us will be, and Unity4J, which I'm sure everybody watching follows at Unity4J. It's a great resource to get updates on Assange's case and certain events taking place around the world. I know that there were some other issues in the news that we did want to address tonight, kind of on the theme of worldwide protests going on. There has been protests also in Barcelona recently. And that's having to do with the fight for independence in Catalonia. And basically people were injured. We're kind of seeing similar things that have happened in Ecuador happening in Barcelona. And there seems to be a group, and when I was reading about them, it seems that they definitely subscribe to the decentralized activism that we really advocate for, because there are no central leaders. I can't remember the exact name of who was potentially behind these protests, but basically there were no leaders. And last I heard, the Spanish government was looking in to see who was behind this. But they said that they were getting their inspiration from Hong Kong and the protests that were taking place there. So I wanted to open it up to discuss a little bit about that. And I think it's important too, in having these conversations, for everybody watching, that there is so much that us activists in the US can learn from the people in Ecuador and in Barcelona and in Hong Kong. If we look at Ecuador, sure, the prospects there are not great. However, at the same time, they still all rose up together and united together, and they were able to at least accomplish something. And that was that they did get Lenin Moreno to kind of pull back on some of his legislation that he was trying to put forth. So I think that's really important. And then also,
I think with Catalonia too, that's like the most not covered revolution happening probably in the world right now. Like, I don't know about all of them, but Catalonia's struggle goes back so far, and their fight for independence. And it's just crazy that even our alternative media sources aren't covering that, because that truly shows that no matter how big or small of an area you believe should be independent, that if you rise up, you can actually at least lay the groundwork and the foundation to get that done. Because they actually, if I remember properly from what I learned about them, they set up their own interim government in Catalonia that was separate from the government that Spain had set up in Catalonia for them. So I think that things like that are really important, to where we could have a second continental Congress as Americans. We could make our own people's Congress and say, no, these are our elected officials, these are our presidents, and this is the system that we're using, and just completely disregard previous systems of power. So I think that with all of the talk of identifying with all of these different things to change people's perspectives, I think trying to lay the foundation and support all these independence movements, even within the United States, is pivotal.
I just want to jump in real quick and remind people that Julian Assange, while he still had internet connection and access to his Twitter account, was tweeting in support of the people of Catalonia, and really right up until when he got gagged, when his internet was turned off. So what's going on there is very relevant in terms of things that Julian supported.
Yeah, if I actually remember correctly, one of Assange's last tweets was a statement from the World Socialist website denouncing the persecution of the leaders of the Catalonian separatist movement. And the World Socialist website, we don't subscribe to Catalonian nationalism or any nationalism for that matter, but it's what the actions that are being taken against the leaders of this movement it's clearly a political prosecution. And people are being sentenced to enormous jail terms because of their political views, essentially. And it sets up a very, very dangerous precedent. But this is the direction that the ruling class is going towards, the criminalization of political positions. It is very, very dangerous.
So Joe, I know that you don't have much more time here. We do have some more things to touch on. You are absolutely welcome to stay and speak with us about the latest going on around the world and concerning Julian Assange's case. But if you do need to head out, if you could just provide some final statements about everything that we spoke about tonight, and then also let everybody know where they can find you on social media. And thank you again so much for joining us. I know our viewers really appreciated everything that you had to say and really valued your perspective tonight. So thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I mean, if I just could, at the end, I mean, the conditions facing Julian Assange are horrific. And yes, watching that video, I mean, it is, how he's being treated, it can't be described as anything but torture. And the fact that this was not an issue at the Democratic Party debate, that it was raised by no one, that this is not a major question on the news programs, that this isn't front page news in the New York Times. It is an absolute condemnation of the entire political system. An individual who is, he's the most significant political prisoner in the world right now. He is, his only crime has been to expose the war crimes of the real criminals. And this is how he's being treated. And I think it is it's a black mark on all those who do not take a stand in defense of Assange. And it's, you know, I just think it's, and the defense of Assange, the defense of Chelsea Manning, you know, it really requires the development and orientation towards a different social force. And there is popular support for Assange. You know, you talk to workers, I mean, to the extent that they know about it, there's support. But of course, even that, you know, I mean, people don't necessarily know because it's not being covered in the media. But this, the campaign to defend Assange really has to be developed. It has to be a continual presence among all those who defend democratic rights. And it really has to be rooted and connected to the fight against imperialism and the fight, in our view, against capitalism. So I'd leave it at that. I think, I wish I could stay a bit longer, but it's been really great to, again, participate in the discussion. In terms of finding me, well, you can find me at Facebook, Twitter, Joseph Kishore. I think I'm at Twitter at jkishore, I believe. I have to double check that. Or the World Socialist website. I would encourage everyone listening to go to the World Socialist website, wsws.org, read it, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us on social media. You know, you can follow everything we have to say on the World Socialist website.
All right, thank you very much. All right, everyone, that was Joe Kishore, and he is a writer with the World Socialist website. I encourage you to check out their work. They really do cover issues that are not being covered in the mainstream media, and it's just very in-depth reporting. And Joe is a writer for the World Socialist website, so do check out his work. It's very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on now, I know we do have some other things to get to tonight. We wanted to touch on yesterday, the panel for press freedom, I believe. But anyways, this happened in New York, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, spoke at this panel, and he specifically addressed Julian Assange's case, and he spoke about his report and finding that there was that Julian Assange was being subjected to torture. He made the great point that the UK and other parties involved, they do not have to necessarily agree with Nils Melzer's findings. However, they are absolutely obligated to address it and to conduct an investigation. They have failed to do so, and it's been several months since he has provided them with this report, yet they have completely abandoned that requirement of having to investigate further. So I want to open it up to my co-host here. What did you guys think of this panel?
So I really don't think it's a surprise that they didn't investigate any further. It's something that they've just completely ignored for this entire time. And I just appreciate the fact that Nils Melzer is speaking up, that he is one of the few people that's willing to say, stop torturing this man. And that's where it becomes our job to then say, hey, we all know this is happening. Let's make sure everyone else knows.
Yeah, I think it's pretty amazing that even after he released a statement and a report earlier this summer, has continued to do these talks and to continue this message and speaking on behalf of Julian Assange and the situation he's under.
And again, too, it's like I was saying earlier, and we've said this many times on the vigils, it's not like the UK has a choice whether or not they can address this report. It's not like they're just making the poor decision to opt out of actually addressing the issue. No, they are obligated under the UN agreement, and there's a specific term for the portion of that agreement where they are required to actually address this. But they're failing to acknowledge that completely, and there's no repercussions for doing so. But again, too, it's really quite something that Nils Melzer continues to talk about Julian's case, because if you think about it, that it's not the only case that he's having to look into. Sure, it's a very high profile one, and it's going to come up, but there's other cases that he has to look at that are, also high profile, and where people are being subjected to some pretty bad conditions. So it's significant that he continuously talks about it. And when he speaks about this, you could just see his sort of shock in the fact of the UK's lack of willingness to really adhere to these regulations. But again, like Andrew was saying, I don't think it's anything to be too surprised about. But then again, it almost is, because this is an agreement that they are meant to adhere to, and they're not. Anything else that you guys got from that panel?
What's the date that the UN runs out of funding here soon? Because I'd heard, I don't know exacts about it, but I heard that the United Nations was essentially getting to the point that they weren't receiving enough funding to continue their programs, and essentially had to start sequestering different portions of the United Nations, or will soon be. So I was wondering if anyone knew any more information about that, like in relation to this. No, I'll have to look that up.
I'm not
That
sure.
day, but I think it is before the end of the year, maybe. That would be, don't quote me on that though, but it did seem, the last thing I saw about that, it did seem like it was fairly soon.
And that's pretty ironic to me, with all of with the actual whistleblowers, like the guy that exposed that the United States had completely lied about the gas attacks in Syria, and then Nils Melzer coming out. And once we as individual citizens see people joining with us at that level to expose these crimes, to expose the false flags and expose the torture, the UN starts becoming defunded. So I just think that that's a really
Looks like
really
end of
interesting time.
October.
Yeah.
And they're already running at a deficit.
Yeah.
So
that's sooner than I thought. So that's
yeah, just a few weeks.
Yeah.
So we may,
less than a couple weeks.
England may just be trying to bide time until they have no international rules-based order left to follow.
Well, and they wouldn't, I mean, their participation in the I think the UN's like criminal court is based on their membership to the European Union as well. Like, it's tied to that. If they successfully Brexit, then there's a whole set of rules that would no longer apply to them.
I love the beautiful paradox, for as terrible as this situation is, that there's no state-based solution to solve the issue that we have right now. Like, the only way that we can actually get Julian free, the only way that we can preserve our free speech and basic rights is by collectively organizing.
Yeah.
And so I just think that, as horrible of a situation that this is, it's happening at a time where everyone else is already starting to come together around all of these other issues. So it gives us, as the like principled free speech activists, the ability to reach so many other groups saying, hey, I want to make sure you can still spread your message. So I guess that's one silver lining, if we have to try to give people a smile every once in a while.
We've got some of Nils Melzer speaking at this forum, and I can throw it on the share screen real quick, because I think, I mean, it's he's his tone has grown increasingly more not alarmist but severe since Julian Assange was, ripped out of the embassy, that had been having a direct live feed to the CIA.
And I
Yeah.
think it's worth noting that Nils Melzer has not seen him in the last few months. So while supporters say there has been another drastic change in his appearance, Nils Melzer has not been back to Belmarsh, as far as I know, to see him recently.
So
It
his
was like
condition could be
May,
quite
right?
worse.
Yeah.
So now we're, of course, speculating because we don't know for sure, but based off of what other people are saying, his situation could be much worse, or his at least like physical well-being could be much worse off than what Nils Melzer, how he was when Nils Melzer saw him. But anyways, here is some footage from the press conference that we are specifically talking about. Again, the person speaking right now is the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, Nils Melzer, who visited Julian Assange while he was in prison to assess his case.
On Julian Assange, the psychological torture, I think there it's important that we really take the big picture here. And we're not kind of splitting it up in thousands of procedural steps. But what this case is about is that we have a man who has founded this WikiLeaks organization, and what he did famously or infamously 10 years ago, approximately, he published huge amounts of information that were considered secret by various states, not only the US, but obviously most prominently by the US, including evidence for prima facie of war crimes. And they're all aware of the collateral murder video, which is the most famous, or again, infamous piece of evidence. And what this should have triggered is investigations by the state of the misconduct. Then, obviously, I acknowledge that whistleblower issues are a problem and can be a problem, and sometimes what whistleblowers do can be punishable under national law. But this also needs to be distinguished from the person actually publishing information that they received from whistleblowers. That's what investigative journalists do. The states never like what investigative journalists do. And if they do it on a huge scale like this, they can get very irritated. And I think that's what happened in this case, because as soon as these publications happened, we see that several states started, I call it, ganging up to initiate proceedings against him for basically just about anything they could. And so we see the sexual allegations in Sweden. We see the espionage charges, as we know now, in the US, for basically what he has been doing is, as I said, doing investigative journalism. So these judicial proceedings, when we look at them, each of them, in all of them, his due process rights have been severely violated. Evidence has been manipulated. His rights have not been respected, even in the UK, the last 6 months. It's only 2 weeks ago that he received access to legal documents. So for 6 months, he's been detained under intense pressure from the US extradition proceedings, and was asked in court to respond to the indictment, but had not even been able to read it. that happens in a state like the UK, to me is very shocking. And
I'm gonna pause that there.
judges have expressed
Oh
open
shit!
bias against him, have insulted him in court without
Never
him
mind.
having given them any cause for this. So what I see here, I'm not his defense counsel. I'm not saying he is not, he has not committed any offense, but the way the states, and these are my counterparts that I'm looking at, have conducted these proceedings cumulatively, have exposed him to, isolated him and exposed him to an intense campaign of public mobbing, I'd say, and consistent arbitrariness, where the medical consequences were measurable, not only psychologically but also physically. Intense anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. I can't disclose everything because of the patient-doctor confidentiality, but it was a clear pattern that's typical for persons exposed to psychological torture. Be happy to elaborate on this further as well. And just a quick remark, because I'm sure my colleagues can speak to the migration detention as well. I clearly, when I visit a country, I try to visit migration centers as well, closed ones certainly, where people are being deprived of their liberty. And even if there is not, well, in some areas there are conditions of detention that are cruel, inhuman, or degrading, or even ill treatment, just the Libyan camps and so on. But even indefinite detention can amount to ill treatment. The longer it goes, the more severe the suffering becomes, and it can cross that threshold at some point. But I'm sure my colleagues will elaborate.
All right. I am going to get this off of share and throw that to anyone who has something to say. I'm gonna collect my thoughts here for a minute because that's the first time I watched that.
So I think I'll start here. I think what's interesting too is that we actually can't see that report. So the worst, not to scare everybody, but the worst information, like, we don't even really know of yet. Of course, you could see Nils Melzer's really holding himself back with what he can say. So the specific details we are unaware of, but I mean, he's using the terms shocked by the UK's behavior. And I think it's important too, when countries like the UK and the US behave in this manner, very powerful countries behave in this way, it really does make it seem like it's okay to other nations as well. And we're seeing a ripple effect when that happens. Anything the United States does, for some reason, other countries will soon follow. We saw that with the investigation into journalists. We started doing that in the US, and then we saw this happening in Australia. We see that across the board with many things. And I think that maybe that is potentially one of the things too that Nils Melzer was alluding to, was that behavior like this by a country that is a very powerful country, that is supposed to be at least one that adheres to respecting human rights and valuing human rights, is outwardly just ignoring that, is something to be very fearful of. Of course, we've been talking about this report for a very long time, but like I said, they do have to eventually address this.
And it infuriates me to no end too, because then you still have people try to pretend like there's any like rule of law or reasonable sense of justice or anything left to our legal system, to the UK's legal system. And it's disgusting to literally have to sit in the United States and watch as my government tortures not just Julian, but Chelsea and Jeremy and Reality, and literally get it to the point that Edward Snowden can't even come back to our country for fear of prosecution. So it's just all of these just horrible things that when you talk to a normal person, they either willfully ignore, don't know, or know but have no idea what to do. And so it's just like, this is just, to me, just makes my blood boil.
Yeah,
Just real quick, Propaganda was asking if he's holding back information for legal reasons. yes, I guess you could say that's why the report cannot be made public. As far as I understand, it would be on the UK to make that decision to make that report public. So it's on the country uh, to make that choice if they want this information to be made available.
And I think, like you said, the medical doctor-patient confidentiality too. I don't know if the report maybe alludes to more things with Assange's condition, but that's, I know the reason he stayed in there, why he couldn't go into more detail on that. And I guess that would be up to Assange and his lawyers if they want to make public anything else, more detail of his condition.
Well, here's the thing. If the CIA had a live feed to the bathroom, the women's bathroom, then I'm going to hypothesize that whatever room Nils Melzer conducted this examination, was equally surveilled, despite whatever assurances he was given. There's no reason to think that, given the entirety of history regarding Julian Assange, that at least every attempt hadn't been made to surveil that. Not only that, but they have a copy of the report. They know. He's delivered the report. I wonder if that's something that you could FOIA.
That might be an interesting idea, because that would be under the purview of like the Department of Justice, because this was one of the biggest the biggest criminal investigation in the United Stats. So there
Let
might be a
let's
lot sitting
let's
underneath
fo-
that.
let's FOIA that.
I would
Let's
love to start doing FOIAs as action
Yeah,
for Assange. Like, I think that would
yeah.
be awesome. We would just have to get some kind of legal heavy hitter behind us and have the ability to regularly pay them to do the work.
I think I think anybody could file a FOIA request.
Well, yeah, but then they deny you and drag you in court, and then you have to actually like sue the federal government to
It
do
shouldn't
your
even be
FOIA
that. I
requests.
believe you, but it shouldn't even be that way. All you have, they have to give you that
Yeah.
information. You just have to be very specific in what you're asking for. Um,
Well, if you look at how the State Department was treating Judicial Watch when they were requesting information, it literally showed conspiracy directly between the heads of the DOJ, the FBI, and Obama and his administration. And he's still receiving documents that he sued for back in 2014. Like,
right.
he's still getting information on Benghazi, for Christ's sakes, and they're releasing it to him 100 pages at a time, and they have 10,000 pages, and they're like, oh, here's 5 every month.
Well, just so everybody knows, if you file a FOIA request for a specific document, and that document does exist because it has to exist, you have to be very specific in what you're requesting. They have to give it to you. They can't. What they're doing is illegal. They have to give you that information. Um, they have, yeah, there's no legal grounds for them to not give you that information if it is a public record. Sure, there are some documents that they cannot give you, but if it is something that's available to the public, they have to do that.
What they can
And
do
even
is
if it's
stall you. They can stall you, install you, install you, and you do eventually have to take them to court in order to get them to release certain documents. And what they can do with Julian Assange is they can say, well, he's we've got these charges against him, and they're national
National
security
security,
charges.
yeah.
Related to him is also now under that
Well,
umbrella of national security. And I'm not saying it's any kind of legit, but I'm saying that's the argument that would be made.
So,
So, national
a journalist out
security-
of Italy, Stefania Marazia, I think still currently is doing one of those, I think with the UK, I believe. And I think she's worked previously with WikiLeaks and is working with Julian's lawyers to try to get documents in Europe. I think it's the UK that she's trying this with. And they've won a couple of those cases, but then when they receive documents, they've either been heavily redacted or then they just finally refuse, even though they do have the right to receive these documents. So she tweets about this quite a bit, and it sounds like she's gotten quite
So
the
national
runaround.
security documents, I know if it is national security, you can't have the rights to request that. But my point that I wanted to make was that so at any time they could say, oh, now this is a national security. So they could just
That's
change
what they were doing with some of Hillary
the
Clinton's emails.
nature of the
Yeah,
file.
that was the way that
doesn't,
they were
that's
hiding
insane. This is so
part of
wrong.
the back end.
This is so wrong. People should be outraged about this. Like, this is so wrong that they could just flip it and say, oh, this is
Everyone
national
knows
security.
that the magic words in DC are "it's a matter of national security," and that is near blanket cover from ever having to declare anything to the public, which is why an organization like WikiLeaks is so vital, which is why it's so important that Julian Assange not be extradited to the US, which is why we need to encourage people, if they can, to support the legal funds of Julian Assange, of WikiLeaks in general, of Chelsea Manning, of Jeremy Hammond, who, by the way, issued one of the most epic fucking statements that I have read in a long time. But yeah,
Do you want to go into that?
we could do that. We could. Let me pull that up.
Real quick, while you're looking for that, I'm going to do a date shout out here for the upcoming activist dates. October 9th, we have Sydney. They're celebrating 19th, I'm sorry. They're celebrating WikiLeaks' birthday then. October 21st is a procedural hearing, which would be a really good date for decentralized activism, as well as protests in downtown London. October 26th is the Correct the Record rally, and that's. Would you know where that's located at?
That is going to be in London in front of the BBC.
Okay, and I wish we could have had Mark here to talk about it. Mark Lubber with Anonymous Bites Back. But November 5th is the Million Mask March. And if you guys don't know what that is, we have an article up on it on our website. But that's it's essentially just a symbolic date to internet revolutionaries. But then special shout out to a group called Candles for Assange. They do regularly scheduled international events. They got up to 62 cities on Julian's birthday. They have different online hashtags if you're involved in getting into the digital activism sphere. But they also want people to go and register their cities so that way they can show people and anyone who will show it to anyone else where these protests are taking place, and that this just isn't a UK thing or an Australia thing, that this is a global movement to free Julian. So they have October 11th, 21st, 26th, November 2nd, 5th, 9th, 11th, and 16th, and then December 10th, and then a special date on December 17th, and that is Chelsea Manning's birthday. So I think we should plan. I'm going to try to see if we can get something special planned for that, because we've brought on a lot of people and supported Julian, but we haven't brought on many people that know Chelsea's story in and out super well. So I'm going to try to see if we can get some special guests on for that day.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Andrew, do you want to update everybody on, real quick before we get to Jeremy Hammond, do you want to update everybody on your experience from, or I guess you talked about it a little bit last night at the
we'll do it after Jeremy Hammond. I'll pick it up at the end and talk
and then
about
your case too. Okay, cool. All right, Steve, I know you wanted to, we should talk about Jeremy Hammond for sure. So Steve, why don't you go ahead?
All right. Well, if you're not aware, Jeremy Hammond was one of the hackers who was involved in the Stratfor documents being passed along to WikiLeaks. He was serving his time in Oklahoma in a prison there, and I don't have the exact date. It was fairly recently. He was just sort of up and moved from where he was in Oklahoma to the exact same facility where Chelsea Manning is. which is right in Arlington, Virginia, right by where the courthouse for the Eastern District of Virginia court is, which is espionage court. That's where John Kiriakou was tried. That's where they would be trying Julian Assange if somehow uh, we cannot prevent his extradition through never letting up on the people who would be able to make that happen. In decentralized and collective ways. But Jeremy Hammond released a statement, and I would like to go ahead and read it because it is one of the coolest things that I read in a while. He says, "As many of you know, I was just a few months away from my scheduled release from federal prison when I was unexpectedly dragged in chains and planes to this raggedy detention center in Alexandria, Virginia. I am outraged that the government is threatening additional jail time if I do not cooperate with their grand jury investigation. Their draconian intimidation tactics could never coerce me into betraying my comrades or my principles. In the spirit of resistance and with great contempt for their system, I am choosing silence over freedom. I am fully prepared for the consequences of my decision, just as I had been each and every time I was faced with similar choices before. Long ago, when I realized that government and capitalism were too hopelessly corrupt and unjust to be reformed through legal or electoral means, I chose to engage in civil disobedience and direct action. I knew then that my actions could land me behind bars, yet I fought on anyway. After a dozen arrests and even a prior federal prison sentence for hacking, I chose once again to use my computer skills to attack the systems of the rich and powerful as part of the anonymous federal case I am doing time for today. When I pled guilty, I took responsibility for my actions and my actions alone. I never agreed to be debriefed or testify in any way, unlike the government's informant, Hector Monsegur, aka Sabu, whose reward was 1 year of probation while I received the maximum sentence allowable by law. It was a painful choice, but 10 years in their dungeons was the price I was willing to pay so I could maintain my integrity. I have never regretted my choices the entire time I have been incarcerated, and having seen and experienced firsthand the abuses and inherent injustice of the prison industrial complex, my commitment to revolution and abolition has only become more deeply entrenched. Now, after 7.5 years of paying my debt to society, the government seeks to punish me further with this vindictive, politically motivated legal maneuver to delay my release, knowing full well that I would never cooperate with their witch hunt. I am opposed to all grand juries, but I am opposed to this one in particular because it is part of the government's ongoing war on free speech, journalists, and whistleblowers. I am insulted that those in power claim that I have an obligation that every citizen owes his government to testify. As an anarchist, I am not part of their social contract and do not recognize the legitimacy of their laws and courts. Instead, I believe in a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quote I had taped to the wall of my prison cell for years. One has an obligation to disobey unjust laws. It is difficult to view any of this government's laws as just when they are so selectively enforced, and when the government turns a blind eye to its own misconduct that is on display every day that Trump is in the White House. In my case, the government, through its informant Sabu, instigated numerous hacks, asking me to break into governments and companies all over the world. Nearly a decade later, This misconduct remains ignored. The NSA continues to surveil everyone and launch cyber attacks. Trump and his corrupt cronies continue to hold the world hostage to their megalomaniacal imperialist pigwhams while simultaneously refusing to comply with subpoenas and inquiries into their own vicious abuses of power. Meanwhile, Chelsea Manning and I are doing hard time in this dump for the crime of refusing to allow our spirits to break after serving our sentences for exposing government and corporate corruption. This absurd hypocrisy and desperate ruthlessness reveals a crumbling legal system, a system that has robbed me of the majority of my adult life but could never take my humanity. I will continue to do the right thing, no matter how long it takes. I know how to do time, and I will never be intimidated by their threats, ever. I refuse. That's Jeremy Hammond from Alexandria, Virginia, letting it, man, I continue to be impressed by that.
That is equally, if not more powerful than the statement that Chelsea Manning put out when she got picked up by the grand jury the second time. That is the most accurate description of what is happening in our world, and to him and to Julian and to Chelsea, that I have heard ever.
Exactly, and I could see in our chat too that a lot of people are moved by Jeremy Hammond's words, and that level of courage is quite extraordinary, because if you think about it, this was somebody that was anticipating being released, and on the basis of their strong principle, and I'm sure he was obviously very much looking forward to that, of course, and then to be brought to this prison in Alexandria, Virginia. Because of this, and being able to face that additional prison time because of his strong stances and beliefs and convictions is something that's so important. And there's very few people in this world who would be willing to really risk their freedom for their own personal stances. So I think it's always important to highlight these individuals, what they have done. And this is why we always wanted to talk about whistleblower rights, and why we do these vigils, to bring awareness to people like Jeremy Hammond, to people like Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and John Kiriakou. And I think that we should probably at the end plug real quick, we should probably also, is there a legal fund for Jeremy Hammond? We should probably start maybe addressing that if there is. I'm not sure,
There's
but
a Jeremy Hammond support committee on Twitter.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Andrew.
But the thing with Jeremy Hammond and this new grand jury too, it just shows how feeble the United States thinks its case actually is, and how dangerous it is for them to proceed with it. Because I think he's in a similar situation with Chelsea Manning, where they want to perjury trap him, get him to say the things he already said, but forget minor details because he's been in prison for the last 7.5 years. And I think that this will eventually follow, just like with Chelsea Manning's case, additional charges against Julian, whether it's when he's in the UK, and God forbid we can't stop his extradition, but if he were to get extradited, because they're using the same legal tactics and processes that they're using against Chelsea, against Jeremy Hammond. And that's something that's indicative and really just shows that they're trying to now use the Stratford emails and the global intelligence file leaks, which he was a part of, as a way to now go after him again. So the case with Chelsea Manning, with her not being willing to perjure herself or to lie, that most likely stopped that case dead in the tracks, because that was most likely their linchpin. They let her go for 18 months when she got out of the military jail. She was freed for that 18 months. Most people don't know this, but she ran for Senate, and none of the independent media covered her, except for towards the end, where there was a not suicide attempt, but basically her putting out a call to help on social media. And that was the only coverage that the independent media gave of Chelsea Manning's campaign. And we could be in a completely different situation if they had elevated her and if they had looked to her as the leader that she actually is. And then after that Senate run, she gets put in for the first grand jury, gets let go from that, is out for a short period of time, and then gets put back in. So they're literally torturing her with the sentences themselves, letting her out, giving her a taste of freedom, saying, all you have to do is lie and you can be free. And she's tasted that twice now, but in this entire process, and she's still standing strong. So I think that people with character like her and Jeremy and Julian just provide such a wonderful example for the way the rest of us should operate.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out Jeremy Hammond um, isn't related to the current indictments. And what it really appears the US is doing is trying to subpoena and is subpoenaing anybody who is related to WikiLeaks, whether they already have them in prison, like Jeremy Hammond, and they're just moving him, through the country and now bringing him to Virginia. Um, Chelsea Manning, who was brought back to prison. We know other people in Europe who have had ties to WikiLeaks have received letters asking them to testify. Some have, some haven't. Um, so I think that it seems like the U.S. government is just really going through the WikiLeaks drops and seeing what sticks and who they can get to talk and what other charges they can start bringing about. Because yeah, like Andrew said, this case with the Chelsea Manning leaks, yeah, I don't know if they really feel like they have a very strong foothold, and the indictments themselves aren't very strong, and will they hold up in the extradition hearing? I'm not sure, and I don't know the legal precedent with once this hearing begins, can they introduce new charges? Can they introduce new indictments? Will that bring us to an additional hearing? I'm not really sure, but this could get very interesting in the coming months with what the U.S. decides to move forward with.
And I think another point too, you said, not being sure if they could introduce new charges after a hearing. But in a way, we've seen a total lack of regard for the law at all times here, where even despite the fact that maybe if they legally could not do so, who's to say that they would even follow that? And
Exactly.
they would probably make another loophole excuse or just go through with it anyway, because we've seen in this case, of course, time and time again that the rules, regulations, and laws are not applying to those in power and those who are trying Assange. But yeah, that was an indicator for sure. The fact that they were potentially trying to draw up some charges with the Stratfor leak. We'll have yet to see what comes of that, though.
Who was I can never remember the name. I'm terrible with names. Who was the German guy that worked with WikiLeaks early on that received
Daniel
Doshberg,
Domscheit-Berg,
who was fired and
right?
sort of a disgruntled WikiLeaks employee,
Right.
if you will. He wrote a book, and thus a movie was made based on some of that material. But he somehow released that letter publicly and said he would not be testifying. That's the last I've heard of that. I'm not sure. I believe he is in Germany currently, so I'm not sure what else can be done to entice him to come to the US or speak to any US officials at this point.
I think that's a really important point too, is that he's often used as a source for the corporate media and mainstream media to talk about Julian's character and further smear his character, when in reality, let's understand that this was somebody that was once a close ally of Julian Assange, and because of his lack of loyalty, I believe, or Daniel Domscheit-Berg's lack of loyalty to WikiLeaks, I believe, or some falling out, his own wrongdoing, Julian chose to fire him. And of course, he was upset by this. So of course, he's going to have negative things to say about Assange and WikiLeaks. So I think it's important whenever you see him being sourced or quoted saying negative things about WikiLeaks and Assange, remember his history with the organization, because it did not end well. And there's a motive for him to paint Assange and WikiLeaks in a very negative way.
And like you said, unfortunately, the mainstream media and Hollywood used that negativity, that motivation from him to characterize Assange, and that's definitely played into the smear campaign, I think, and to paint a portrait of somebody who's arrogant, narcissistic, doesn't care about people. And yeah, unfortunately, Daniel's words have really echoed through history in contributing to that smear campaign.
Yeah, the movie, I can't
The Fifth
remember.
Estate.
Yes, it was all about his book. It was all one side.
Yeah, it was.
Mhm.
And if you, it actually, one of the stories recently came out that, so Benedict Cumberbatch played Julian Assange. He wrote to him in the embassy asking to meet him, and Julian Assange's letter back to him was actually published, where Julian did not want to meet with him because he did not want to give any credit to this film, and he tried to warn him against playing him in this film, and said that it would not be good for either of them, and it tried to explain what the media and what Hollywood was trying to do with this film, and how it would not accurately depict him or his staff at WikiLeaks, and it obviously did not.
Right. Any other? Oh, Andrew.
No, I
you're-
was
Okay.
not related on that, but I was just going to transition to my court case by saying I did take a plea deal, and I kind of want to get into the nuances why, because it's pretty quick to explain. But long story short, I had been charged with advertising on public property in 2 different instances for hanging signs that read, Chelsea Manning is a POW, no more torture, jail war criminals, free Julian Assange, Assange told us the truth. At the time, I think I actually had resist, resist, resist posters too. And they dropped one of the charges, fined me for the other one, plus court costs, gave me 90 days to pay for it. And I'm not done with this fight. My attorney, essentially, who's a longtime activist, transitioned into an actual activist attorney, basically explained to me that the going through the courts to achieve the goal of changing this city's law would ultimately, if it was appealed, just reinforce the law itself, because it was put in place with time, date, and or non-content restriction, which basically meant it banned everything. And then it was followed up with a zoning code that explicitly states everything about what it actually means to be public property in Oberlin, which gets down to literally like curb lawns, trees that are within city limits or on city easements. So the avenue that I'm going to try to pursue is change to the city council to actually get the law changed. And so I'll go into that kind of on some more vigils, because it's something that I'm going to tie it to municipal internet and municipal banking and different things like that, that you can apply pressure, get candidates removed, or get candidates to listen to you most effectively and pretty much only on the local levels to try to get change done. So that's something that, as I write up a game plan and work on that, I'll come back and talk to it. But also too, I went to the DNC debates last night, and I showed up at about 8:30, and I was just wandering around the areas where they'd put up our posters, where we had put up our posters, and myself, Jorge, and Sam, who have been on previous vigils, went out with me. We put the posters up 10 to 15 feet on poles. There was somewhere in the vicinity of 200 to 300. I didn't have I wasn't keeping track. But that was Sunday evening. On Tuesday afternoon, Chavista Misty, who's also another contributor, I would say, in a way, to the vigils, she went out and put up another batch full. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but just to go in full detail, they were completely removed. When I had got there, the city was literally on police lockdown, which isn't surprising for like an oligarchy event, but it was to the point that they had camera drones flying around. They had undercover police officers fucking everywhere. They had bike squads. It was literally a display of a domestic military force, akin to what you could consider a military parade, just by the level of equipment that they had out there, all of the undercover agents, the drones, the vehicles parked everywhere. They had APCs out there, like they were ready for domestic war. And that's what they were demonstrating was, we live in an ivory tower and we're not letting anyone in. To the point that when I was wandering around trying to find a place to go to, The watch parties there and all of the debate areas, you had to either have a ticket sanctioned by the Democratic Party, a pass by CNN, or a pass by New York Times. And if you didn't have one of those things, you couldn't get to the watch party right on main campus, and you couldn't even get to the area where the debates were being held, at least at the point that I had gotten there. So it's disgusting. And in 2016, Jill Stein was the only candidate who actually called for a demilitarization of the police. And there's a whole backstory to that you can look up with the way the military sold guns through grant programs to police officers, specifically to get around city council and a bunch of other things. But long story short, there was more Trump supporters than there was Democrats total, at least for the part of the city that I was in, which was literally the place that had all of the bars, Main Street, multiple outdoor viewing parties. There was, again, more Trump supporters there just in opposition than there was Democrats total. And I was pretty upset that I couldn't live stream. I was having some issues with my internet connecting with Restream and getting that up just with all the data consumption that it takes. But there really wasn't much to show. Like it was really underwhelming. So what I ended up doing was just walking down the street with the signs that I had left over from Sunday night, and I put a sign on every single car up and down the street for about 5 or 6 blocks. I would just walk and just set it. I wouldn't touch the vehicle. I would basically drop the sign on it and move to the next one. And as I was canvassing the vehicles, if anyone had walked past me, I would ask them, "Hey, do you have a second? I want to talk to you about Julian Assange," or "What candidate are you here to support?" or "How does your candidate feel about Assange?" if they had buttons on. And everyone, if you kept it framed in an issue specific manner, always supported Julian Assange. There were some people that would give the pushback of, "Well, I like that he did it, but it was still illegal," and just some of the mainstream media talking points. But you can reach people if you put candidates aside, if you put teams aside and just say, "Hey, what do you think about this thing that's happening?" You completely reframe the conversation to where I was having 2 or 3 minute conversations with like Andrew Yang supporters, because there was probably more of them than anyone on the Democratic field out there. And it was conversations of them about how they felt about WikiLeaks and letting them tell their stories, and then saying, "Did you see what Andrew Yang said about Julian?" And everyone was like, "No, what'd he say?" And then you just explain that Andrew Yang's just another corporatist war criminal, and they go, I didn't know that he didn't support it." And so just reaching people at these events on an issue specific way right now is so pivotal, because not that it's going to change the world to get a candidate to say Julian Assange's name on stage, but it means that the pressure we're applying is working in a way that they can no longer ignore us. So I think that that's something that's really important to recognize is we have the ability to change this, but it's going to be one person at a time, going to events, shaking hands, putting up signs, or however you choose to engage in this. So I just really hope that people take up these next event dates that are out there and choose to do something within their community to be his voice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. It's really interesting to hear your interactions with people there, and that they didn't even know what their candidate was saying about Julian Assange or has said about Assange in the past. I wish I could have been there with you, but happy that you were able to get out there. Too bad the damn internet connection. But I think
Mhm.
what's really
I
disturbing about all this is that you were not granted access because you didn't have the pre-approved, is what I would call it, the pre-approved badge of the New York Times, CNN, or whomever.
so I
That's really
actually
just
have a tactic to get that next time. If
okay.
I can get us the ability to go to a Democratic debate, I can probably get us at least tickets to get inside of the building. So that might be something interesting.
Yeah. So we do have a couple more topics we want to talk about tonight. So we wanted to discuss MIA's press conference that she had outside of Belmarsh prison after she met with Julian Assange. I think it's great that celebrities are going to visit Assange, not only to kind of give him company for his own sake and for him mentally to have visitors, but also because it does bring greater awareness to this issue in general. And I think it does put Julian Assange into the minds of people who otherwise wouldn't be exposed to this political issue or related political issues. And it also even opens up the slight opportunity that maybe entertainment news may have to cover this. Now, granted, they're not going to do a great job of that, but at least it gets people familiar with his name. But I liked her message. I know Christy and I were really put off by something that she said, where I literally had to rewind and listen to it like 3 times because I was like, am I hearing her correctly? Off of the subject of her specifically talking to Assange about his case, but she said she told him about Ellen DeGeneres and George Bush hanging out. And she said that, she told Julian about this to kind of lift his spirits or to like give him some good news about the world. And she told him, oh yeah, both of them are hanging out, and George Bush has changed. And Christy, I know you had some thoughts on this as well when you first heard this. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I had thought
It was
maybe she
odd.
was being sarcastic, like because she was saying, somebody asked what they talked about, and she said she was just trying to update him what's going on in the world. And she kind of said, I talked about the Ellen story, but yeah, then I kind of re-listened to it too, and it was almost like she told it to him in a hopeful way. And I said, I don't know if you can convince Julian Assange that George W. Bush has changed. So that was kind of a weird anecdotal story she told on, trying to tell that to him in a good way. And maybe, I don't know, maybe she just misspoke, or it was just kind of weird.
It was super weird because, yeah, at first one would think that she would be saying that jokingly, but then I thought it too. At the end of the day, this is somebody that is very much out of touch with the average person still. I mean, I'm glad that she's visiting Julian. That's huge, and that she cares about him and related issues. But at the end of the day, this is a extremely wealthy person that is living a life that none of us here could possibly imagine. I mean, this is an out of touch person. So at the end of the day, I guess I'm not so surprised by her statement. But Christy, you had the great point of saying, I can't imagine what Julian was thinking when he heard that. I mean, he had to have been like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah, as an uplifting story to him, and somebody who's very isolated away from the world and the mainstream media news and stuff, that he had to kind of cock his head and be like, what are you talking about? So she didn't say what his reaction was to that story. I did want to bring up the point that she was asked about Nils Melzer report, and the UK responding, saying that basically saying they're not going to respond to it, and they're denying torture. And she did tell the story that she mentioned she's been coming on a weekly basis to give him a yoga book, and they're not allowed to bring anything in with them. She's tried to bring things like a sketchbook, just something he can write or draw. Also, she even mentioned, trying to bring something like Sudoku or some sort of puzzle type thing, just to keep his brain, stimulated. And she kind of indicated that maybe she's kind of been pushed around or not really treated the best when she tries to bring these things to him. I believe this is the second time she's been able to visit him. And she talked about, the prisoners not having dignity and allowance to own the space between their ears, and that she did sympathize with people who are saying he's being treated unfairly, and that was her experience. And I did want to say that every person who has come out of Belmarsh after visiting him, they have a certain look to them. It's not a happy look. They kind of look a little shell-shocked. And I think the process, and Flick Ruby wrote a really good story of her experience of going through security and getting to the point of seeing Julian and what you have to go through. And I've just noticed with people that come out and talk to the media that they look a little shaken up, that they've had to see their friend or their family member. John Shipton has been there multiple times in this condition. And so I just want to explain that while it is good he's getting social visits, he is still in a very cruel and um, a ridiculous place for a journalist waiting extradition hearing. That this is a bit extreme, and I think that really shows in his visitors when they come out.
Yeah, that's a good
I
point.
think the best way to describe his situation would be he's in a cruel and unusual situation, a thing that something we're all just blanketly supposed to be protected from by
Yeah.
government.
Yeah, I like your use of that language there. That's true, because it really shows that this is completely un-American what's happening here, on principle. But we did. Are we going to show the video? It is okay. Yeah, I mean it's like 22 minutes long. So if you guys are interested in watching it, you could check it out on your own. You could find it on YouTube after the vigil, of course. But we also have another bit of information we wanted to touch on, and this deals with ABC. I am not completely familiar on this. If one of you want to kind of explain that situation and why people were so outraged by this.
Yeah. What happened was, I think Sunday going into Monday, if I remember correctly, the one of the weekend shows and then Good Morning America ran this video. I'm gonna share the screen here real quick and move you guys over here. So the headline reads "Slaughter in Syria," and Trump orders American troops to withdraw. So this is what happens, of course, on ABC if troop withdrawal is discussed. Are they talking about the 2,800 troops that just went to Saudi Arabia? Fuck no, they're not. They're not going to do that. But look, so they're playing this clip, which turns out the explosions in the video are identical to explosions seen in a video titled Knob Creek Night Shoot 2017. Knob Creek Gun Ranch in the town of West Point, Kentucky hosts a biannual event called the Military Gun Shoot and Military Gun Show. And yeah, here they are. The exact same from a handheld cell phone at this freaking gun show. So ABC aired it not once but twice. I'm gonna kick it back over to the Brady Bunch screen. And eventually had to take it down, but it's one of those, page 26 buried below the fold where they gave you, 50 words total to print that entire retraction compared to this headline. And it's not like there's not open war right now in Syria. Um, and I honestly, I don't understand all of the implications behind it perfectly. Um, but why ABC? Do you need, are you that lazy? Is it just
So
vetting
that's it.
process? I mean,
They did slap a filter on it. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably just from Instagram. But no, that's how propaganda works, right? So the number of people that saw it on those two programs and then shared those articles when they were current is greater than the number of people that saw the retraction for the article. So therefore, you have influenced a certain portion of the population that won't see the retraction to believe that the Kurds are being slaughtered in Syria because Trump withdrew troops. That is how disinformation works. That is how this entire system runs, is by trying to selectively implement different facts. They called them alternative facts into the population in specific segments to allow them to believe things separate from other portions of the population. So turn on Fox News and watch Fox News, as terrible as it is, for 2 hours.
No.
And then turn on CNN and watch that for 2 hours. And just compare the different universes that our media has forced people to live in. Like, if you are a Fox News viewer, which as little as they are, that's still a large portion of the voting population in this country, you believe a completely different build of the world, base fact realities, than people that watch CNN and people that watch MSNBC and that people that watch YouTube. Like, we all have different points that we try to identify the world that we live in, whether you think they're fighting the deep state or you think Trump worked with the Russians. It's literally all built to reinforce itself. So that way it keeps you saying, no, Trump's fighting the deep state, and they say, no, Trump's corrupted by the Russians, when it's really, they're all just making a fuckload of money. Like,
Well,
that's the end. That's how the story ends, and I'm sorry to ruin it, is that we got fucking robbed. Like, we've gotten
Again.
robbed since September
Still.
11th, 2001, and we've gotten robbed since human history has started as human beings, because we have allowed ourselves to be subjugated by a force that is ultimately there to try to take as much from us as possible. It's literally the predator-prey relationship.
And we talked earlier about how Trump just uses things like this, and he tweeted this exact video about 7 hours ago, you know, with a fake news thing across it. And so this is just playing into you know, Trump's ongoing discourse with the mainstream media and calling them fake news. And it's just, we talk about this a lot, about why aren't Democrats going after legit things on Trump, but instead the media and the Democrats just sort of hand him these things that he can just use to continue his games. And yeah, it's really seems like everybody's playing behind the scenes on one team just to manipulate us.
And the whole thing with impeachment too, I want to call that entire narrative out as it stands right now. And I know Steve did earlier, but I just kind of want to make my prediction for how the propaganda machine will work behind the scenes with it. The House will start the process, and for the Senate to be able to deny the impeachment, they have to first open the proceedings. So when that happens, the Democrats will then run the media blitz of the Senate is impeaching Trump. And that's going to be what that spin is put on there to try to just make people think that that's what's going to happen. So I want to point that out too, is to actually decline and reject the motion, they first have to open it and say, yes, we'll investigate impeachment.
Could you imagine how many issues would be ignored if we had the 2020 presidential election to be covered and an impeachment trial? This is going to be, it's obviously going to drag out for a long time, say if this does follow through. I mean, can you imagine? We already know that with the 2020 coverage, there would be other issues that are happening wouldn't be covered. But that in addition,
Julian Assange won't be covered if there's an impeachment trial.
Great way to provide cover while you're rigging a primary.
Yeah.
What a wonderful distraction for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So we had actually dropped for a little bit and I didn't notice.
Oh, shoot.
I don't know how long we're back now, but
okay.
No, we're still offline actually.
Oh, shit. Yeah.
On
we just said we
Restream.
died.
Wow. Yeah, I'll tell you when it comes up.
I think we're back.
Are we
Maybe.
back?
Are we? Okay.
Are we?
I don't know. Restream
No,
You
says
guys tell
we're
us in the
not.
chat if we're back.
Yeah. I'm seeing debt.
Propaganda says it is back.
Okay.
Wow.
So Taylor, maybe make that point again, because I think it cut you off as you were stating.
Okay. So what I was saying was, can you guys imagine the amount of issues, important issues that will not be covered if we have a 2020 election, presidential election taking place while we are impeaching the current president, because that's going to be a long drawn out process if it does follow through. And the point is that it's a great way to distract people from a potential election rigging, as Steve was saying. It, I mean, not only will issues that really matter that we need to be talking about in general not be covered, but it does also provide an easier way for the media to distract against some issues going on with the election that maybe they don't want to be noticed. And having
will
Julian
definitely-
Assange in prison while we're in an election is, I think, a really big goal too.
Yeah, and definitely his extradition hearing and any appeals or anything that happens after that will just get weighted down by an impeachment trial. The mainstream media, at least here in America, will solely focus on that. You can count on the 24/7 hour news channels to give you nothing but impeachment coverage.
And you'll see how that
nonstop.
fast they move on it based on how well Bernie Sanders does in like the 3 or 4 states. What's weird
And then on top of that, you have Oh, no,
is
sorry,
they
go ahead.
bumped up California and moved our primary from like dead freaking last almost to March, one of the it's one of the earlier primaries now, and they did it because at the time the Hamptons money and the Clinton campaign blessing was going to Kamala Harris. So they completely they screwed themselves because she's polling at like nothing. She's 5th in her home state right now.
Yeah.
Like that was some primary rigging that backfired that I find personally hilarious. But if they need to, they'll do what they did in 2016, which is put up the address of polling stations was happened. There were addresses for polling stations on Hillary Clinton's website that did not match with existing polling station locations. So if they need to, they can repeat that. And if they need to do it for Warren, I'm sure they're flexible enough to go from one puppet to the next. She would be as Pat the Burner Silly Rabbit said, the first white woman of color to be elected president.
Right, and then a lot of news media outlets were claiming that she was the winner of the debate last night, and so Warren getting propped up again is still news. We're still trying to get her up, and yeah. So primary season starts February 3rd here in Iowa. We caucus, which is a very strange system because the parties do it very differently here. And then I believe New Hampshire is the week after that. And so yeah, it's going to be, I think February, March is going to be very interesting for the Democrats. And we're going to see, I think, a continued, the media trying to prop up anybody but Bernie until then.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like they were definitely, or the candidates were going after Liz Warren. It seems
Well-
like she was definitely kind of
They
targeted.
went to
in a way.
commercial when Tulsi Gabbard tried to do it for a second time.
Yeah, and you
The
can see her face too.
The look on Warren's face when she was like,
You're in the headlights.
I would like you to join me in this.
I loved it.
And she was like,
Yeah.
Like, it's really hard for Warren to lose the debate when she literally had half an hour out of a 2-hour show to talk.
did you?
I think she had the most talking time.
It out.
Yeah.
I
She
think
had more
so.
talk time than the bottom 5 people combined. which I'm surprised with the way like her money ratio's out, it wouldn't be more than the bottom 99%. But like they literally just let her run wild. Like there was one point where the host, yeah, right, where the host was like, "You need to stop, Elizabeth," and she's just
let her
talking, and
go.
he's like, "Oh well, I guess there's nothing we can do.
Let
We
her
cut the mic
talk.
on Andrew Yang 2 weeks ago, but."
I tweeted out that she could like talk a band full of meth heads to sleep, avoiding answering a question. And she did that the entire time, man. Could we get a yes or no out of you? Well, you see, the thing is,
No, I can't stand that.
oh,
And they
And
just
she
let
has a
it
plan
happen.
for everything. She has a plan, but I have not heard her talk about any of these plans.
Well, because if she reveals them, someone will know that
Thing we
Bernie
gotta
Sanders.
remember is that my grandmother was once on the set of
Oh my gosh.
Andy Griffith's show, and I don't, like whatever the babble that comes out, the nonsense, and how people could sit there and be like, "Yep, that's my gal."
It really amazes me though that people could watch that, observe that, and still support her along with the rest of them, honestly.
Well,
But
I
yeah,
mean, we
and
have
I'm
two
sick
white
of these
teachers out for that.
stories. You're right. But another thing too is that these stories that they tell, then they didn't really do it too much last night, but they do that. They use these stories as like anecdotal evidence of being able to make it big, like their great grandfather started out poor and then they had this miraculous life-changing event and stroke of luck, and then they became a CEO of whatever company and are millionaires. They didn't do much of that last night, but again, it does go back to who cares and what does that have to do with how you are going to rule and lead this country?
Unless you're Beto O'Rourke, and then you're just fucking born to do it. Like then it's just what you're made to do.
His history is odd to me. Like I don't know how he got into politics. His background.
So
Bobby
I want to.
Franny, not Beto. His dad gave him that freaking nickname in case he ever ran for office and needed to appeal to
Robert
the
Francis, isn't that his name?
I prefer to refer to him as psychedelic warlord
yeah,
from Cult of the Dead Cow, because that's my favorite part. Like I hope he wins just so I can hear Donald Trump pretend to talk like Beto O'Rourke. Like I can't even do a Donald Trump impersonation of Beto O'Rourke. That's just too far out there. But him literally reading Beto's words about fantasizing about killing elementary school children.
It's really weird.
Like fucking do it. Like I hope the oligarchy puts Beto up there because that's just gonna make me smile.
It's not gonna happen, man. That's
right. No, I know.
I forgot Beto was even still in it until tonight,
right.
honestly.
Everyone does.
What about Cory Booker?
Oh.
Cory Booker, like when do you hear of him? It's so ridiculous. These people need to realize that they do not
Cory
have
Booker
a chance.
Is up there trying to remind people that he's still in it too, and
according
women
to
are people.
CNN,
I'm a vegan, like me.
Have you guys seen the Project Veritas releases on CNN? No,
I have not, but I've heard a little bit about the videos that were released. I have not personally watched them yet.
So it literally just tells us everything we already know. Like it's nothing like groundbreaking, but there is one part of it where I don't know who he's talking to, the undercover guy, but he literally says like, no, we wouldn't cover an inner city shooting like we'd cover a shooting in Cory Booker's district. Like said some shit like that. And I'm like, that's interesting considering there was a shooting out in Beto O'Rourke City that he then decided to build a whole platform on gun control on and have a 30-minute debate and then be silent for the rest of it.
Yeah, he definitely took that to his advantage after that shooting happened. He definitely did. Because I don't think he was, I mean, I think his position hasn't changed, but he definitely took that incident and ran with it. Because every time guns come up, they automatically go to, I was going to say Beto, but Steve's going to get mad.
I think he should embrace the Texanness of his name and like appeal to the NASCAR circuit and refer to himself as Bobby Franny. I think if like Bobby Franny. Like
when I see fucking Beto, all I can think of is Cam Brady. like from the campaign. That's who I picture. Like if they had to cut and paste that into real life, that is Cam Brady.
But wait,
Like
we haven't talked about the plaid elephant in the room that is Tom Strayer. Is that his?
Oh, Steyer. I was like, who the
That's
hell
it.
is this?
he was the
Yeah,
only person. He was the second to the bottom in talk time. It was Tulsi and then Tom Steyer.
Yeah, so he
Wait,
kind
he
of
had
came
more
out of
time than
nowhere.
her?
The CNN has the times. They were showing them live on their website. And I was like, why would you show that? Like that's
Because they're
incorrect.
transparent, Andrew. They're
In the
transparent.
first 45
Banana.
minutes of that debate, Tulsi Gabbard spoke for 1 minute and 49 seconds. In the first 45 minutes. Like,
And didn't use that time to drive the point home about our intelligence communities, about the threat against Julian Assange, or anything else that gets to the core root of the issues that we're having, which isn't Trump, it is the entire system behind it that gave us him.
well, nor did at any point she really say like, or maybe she didn't. It was the 10 minutes I was up and making tea or something, but I almost boycotted the debates tonight because this is a rigged fucking process. Like, we know it's a rigged process. I knew it was a rigged process. That's my public reason for stepping down as vice chair of the DNC back in 2015, 2016, whenever that was. Like that would have been a great time. I mean, I understand that this is a political process. She got to present herself in a likable way politically, and that rocking the boat is something that she's only going to take so far.
But that's where,
and that's
if
well,
she
that's why
was
I say you either run for president because you're following orders or you want to die.
So I have a question for our chat, for everyone who's still there. Could you tell me your second favorite Council on Foreign Relations member? That's where I'll leave that.
Mine's Dennis Kucinich.
That's what I was gonna say, but I was gonna see if someone brought that up.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. I think because no one knows that. No one talks about that. No one brings that up. So that was going to be my fun fact.
I did. I brought it up on the show. Like he was right smack dab in the middle of his CFR tenure when he delivered the final nail in the coffin to the public option on the Obamacare. Remember when they dragged him out and made him be like, yeah, the public option's off the table. That was I think year 2 or 3 of his run at the CFR.
Did you cover the story on Slow News Day where they started funding anti-war think tanks?
I might have talked about it, but I don't know if I specifically did.
Right, because that's a really because that comes to my mind a lot when I hear the term regime change war specifically. Because she did, and our chat's given a lot of love to her for calling out the wars and calling out the parties for being warlike and going to war all the time. But at the same time, that doesn't inherently make her anti-war. That makes her anti-regime change war. And I know it's been a debunked thing and that people have covered it, but she's still in the fucking military. Like, you are electing a major from the military to be your president. That is taking someone directly out of the ranks of the people.
Chat's gonna jump in with as a medic, so I'm gonna do that before that.
Yeah, but like that's, and not even to just say don't vote for her because of that, but I'm saying get answers to these questions, like apply and find ways to bring out left-wing pressure, because there is none. Nina Turner doesn't answer to the left, Bernie Sanders doesn't answer to the left, Dennis Kucinich doesn't answer to the left, and neither does Tulsi. They'll go on right-wing shows and mainstream media so that way they don't have to have hard-hitting left-wing conversations, whether it's Bernie Sanders not being willing to go on Jimmy Dore, or Tulsi Gabbard not being willing to circulate through the independent media circuit with shows like Tim Black and Jamal Thomas, where they would get asked uncomfortable foreign policy questions. So I think that that's important to call out too, because there's a lot of hate for Tulsi from the mainstream, but at the same time, we're inundated with propaganda constantly. So not that to be in support or against her, but that we need to find ways to get her to answer to us and prove to the left wing that she can provide the actual responses to these real questions and issues. So that's my rant on Tulsi for the night.
Okay. I think regime change is becoming the new solidarity. No,
It's
but
just
I get your point. No, I get your
Yeah.
point.
Really
It
is a
makes sense.
think tanky
It
thing.
is. It
And,
is.
Right.
and yeah, somebody, Ryan for Prez says, are all wars regime change wars? Yes. But I said it earlier when Joe was on. I said it the entire flipping time. Yes, and if you are for the drone program, if you support the drone program in whatever limited fashion you say you support the drone program, you are still supporting the intelligence that precedes every single drone strike. You are supporting the agencies that go out and collect this intelligence. You're supporting the systems that are entrenched by these agencies. And it's not, you are not the anti-war candidate. You are the anti-unpopular wars candidate.
Yeah. Before we close out with as we go around, any last bits of information any of you want to bring up? I guess not.
Not really. We had a long show.
We had a
Been a very
really
long
long
show.
show. It was almost about 2.5 hours.
So I am in contact, real quick, just to add something then, for one closing thing. I am in contact with someone who is involved with the strikes in Chicago for the teachers union. So I'm going to see what I can do to get them on at some point here soon to talk about that and try to find ways to stand in solidarity or action with them.
Great. So I guess I guess I'll start. We always try to figure out how to do this. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. We are really happy that you join us every Wednesday. We really love doing these. Well, again, I'm speaking for all of you guys. I keep saying we.
It's okay.
I keep doing that. But yeah, we really do put a lot of effort into these vigils, and we're really happy that you guys are responding to them well and care about this issue because it is really important. And so I want to thank everybody for watching tonight. I don't think I have any updates to give any of you guys. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and you can follow ActionForAssange at action_4Assange. My name is Taylor Hudak. You can follow me on Twitter at _Taylor Hudak. And then also, I'm sure many of you watching are familiar with the 1 versus 5I campaign. Follow that campaign on Twitter at #1 vs 5 the letter I. That is journalist and activist Susie Dawson's campaign taking on the 5 Eyes, which is an interconnected network of intelligence agencies. And she also holds teach-ins on Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time in the US. And you can find that on her YouTube channel, Susie3D. So thank you guys again so much for watching.
We just had a comment that somebody got back from the store and that we are still on. Yes, we are still on, and thank you for staying with us. I know it's very late in many of the time zones in the US. So thank you again for joining us. This was our 15th week of doing these vigils. And like Taylor said, we really put a lot of work into them. We really enjoy them, and we really like interacting with everybody in the chat too. We always think we're very lucky to have a chat who talks with us and corresponds with us throughout the show. So yeah, my name is Christy Doff. You can follow me at ChristyMKD84 on Twitter. You can also follow Unity4J on Twitter. Please let us know if we can help promo your event. And really, if you are in the UK and you're watching, please think about going to the Magistrates Court on October 21st that morning, because Julian Assange will be, is expected to be, I should say, at that hearing in person. And we really want to show, hopefully he gets to see everyone there. I'm not sure, they'll probably take him in a different entrance, but we still want the media and we want everyone around that area to know that his supporters will be there.
So to close out, Propaganda said we should use the Tulsi campaign to boost issues. That is exactly why we invited her repeatedly to the September 11th episode, as well as invited her repeatedly to attend this episode, as well as a lot of the space in between. But you can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. And you can find us online, ActionForAssange.com. If you're interested in organizing and aren't sure where to start, feel free to email me. And that's ActionForAssange@protonmail.com.
And then also real quick, we forgot to mention, so of course the London hearing is approaching. We talked about the hearing that is on this upcoming Monday, October 21st, but of course the big hearing where we'll learn even more information about the extradition is on February 25th. Because we know we cannot rely on the mainstream media, the corporate media, to cover the case fairly, we want to cover it for you. And we have, intentions to go out to London and cover this for you guys. We would have to be there for like a week and a half because we do not know how long it will go on for, but we can expect it to be at least 5 days. But we want to make sure that we're there the entire time. But again, it is really important that there is independent media and people who are very knowledgeable on the Assange case in general that are there. Of course, we cover this on a weekly basis and is something that we want to be able to share with you guys. When we're there, we plan to go live, show you guys everything that's going on, and we'll really prepare for that. So all of us are very determined to do this, and we know that you guys were excited about it. So we will be launching a crowdfunding page after October 21st on Monday. After that date, we will have a crowdfunding page because going out to London is obviously a expensive trip, but what's to be gained from our being there is that you guys get accurate information and that you guys are able to see firsthand what is going on. And that way you don't have to rely on mainstream media sources or corporate media for the information. You'll be getting it from us, from people you trust and from people you know. And we all plan to, go out there together and really highlight what's going on, because this is very serious and it's important for us all to take the time to be there and cover it. It's one thing that we could do even to help Julian too, because we know that they're going to smear him and use that to distract from what's really happening. So again, we will have a crowdfunding page after October 21st. And we're really excited and excited to bring you accurate information. And of course, very much anticipating the right decision in this case to be made, which is to not extradite him to the United States. And in the meantime, as we do prepare to head out there in February, we're going to be holding events, taking actions to bring awareness to his case to make sure that he is not extradited to the US. So we'll have that up next week. And our last co-host of the night, Andrew, go ahead.
Steve.
I'm sorry. Why? I've been looking at you the whole time because your face is on the screen. So that's why I said Andrew. All right, our last one, Steve, go ahead. I'm sorry about that.
Hi, thanks, Christy. I'm Steve Poikinen. I host a show called Slow News Day. You can find me on the YouTubes. If you are so inclined. I'm sorry, I'm beat, man. I've been having killer days at work. I can't wait to go to Betty by. I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this with us. I host normally host a weekly Sunday show. I'll be out of town this weekend. Um, but more often than not, you can always find me Sunday morning my time, 10 a.m. Pacific, um, which is 1 in the afternoon on the East Coast. Uh, and I have incredible guests and do my goddamnedest to not rely on the mainstream media as the baseline material for my content, which I think is something that more people in independent media should do. So thank you all very, very much. Much love to you. And thanks to my co-hosts, and we will see you next week.
Bye.